The heat over Crimson Ridge warped the air into liquid glass, bending light, until distance became a lie. Elijah Stone wiped the soot from his forge onto a rag, already blackened beyond cleaning, listening to the wind carry something that didn't belong. Half animal cry, half human. Gasp, the sound of fear. Given voice. He set down the horseshoe he'd been shaping, metal still glowing angry red, and moved toward the eastern fence line where his property bled into the open range. The sun hammered down with the weight of a grudge. Sweat traced lines through the dust on his forearm, arms corded with muscle, earned not from vanity, but from survival. 10 years of working iron had carved his body into something functional, built for endurance rather than beauty. At 34, Elijah looked older, jaw shadowed by 3 days of stowable, eyes carrying the particular wariness of a man who'd seen things he couldn't unsee, done things he couldn't undo. The sound came again, weaker this time, threaded with desperation. He found her tied to the fence post where his land met the territory's forgotten stretches, a young Apache woman bound with rope that had drawn blood from resistance. Her wrists swelled purple and raw where she'd fought the bindings. Dark hair fell across her face in matted strands, and her chest rose and fell in shallow, pained rhythms. Beside her, a bay mare trembled on 3 legs. The fourth held awkwardly blood seeping through a makeshift wrap of torn cloth. Elijah's knife cleared its sheath in one smooth motion. He cut the rope with a single stroke, catching her weight as she collapsed forward. Her eyes snapped open, brown and fierce despite the trauma written across her body, and she forced her head up to look at him. A white man, another white man. Her lips parted, voice scraped raw by sun and suffering. Do whatever you want, cowboy. The words hit him like a fist to the sternum. Not a plea. Not even resignation. Just the flat acceptance of someone who'd learned that fighting men like him only made them crueler. She'd surrendered before he could demand surrender, offered compliance before he could take it, and the weight of what that meant, of what had been done to her, to teach her that response made something hot and acidic rise in his throat. Elijah didn't touch her roughly, didn't grab or restrain or assert ownership the way she clearly expected. He knelt slowly, keeping his movements visible, unthreatening. I'm here to help you. That's all. She studied him through half-closed lids, searching for the lie, for the violence she knew was coming. When he lifted her carefully as if she might shatter, she tensed but didn't fight. Couldn't fight. Her body had already surrendered, even if her mind refused to. The mare nickered softly, a sound of pain and confusion. Elijah took a moment to check the injury, running experienced hands over the swollen joint. Sprain may be worse. Whoever had done this hadn't just hurt a woman, they'd crippled an animal for sport or spite, or both. He carried the woman toward his homestead, a weathered structure of sun-bleached wood that crouched against the ridge like it was trying not to be noticed. The cabin wasn't much, 2 rooms and a forge shed, a corral that needed mending, a well that had to be cranked by hand, but it was his. Paid for with money earned from honest work, built with his own scarred hands, maintained through stubbornness and the kind of solitude that either broke men or tempered them. Inside the cabin smelled of iron and sage, the latter burned each morning to keep insects away, and because the ritual of it grounded him. He laid her on the narrow bed near the window, where afternoon light fell in amber bars across quilted blankets. She weighed almost nothing, her body stripped lean by whatever life had brought her to this moment. Up close, he could see hers properly, sharp cheekbones that spoke of beauty, not yet beaten down by hardship, lips cracked from thirst, a small scar bisecting her left eyebrow that had healed years ago. Maybe 22, maybe younger. Too young to carry the kind of exhaustion that lived in her eyes. Elijah moved through the cabin with the efficiency of long practice. He poured water from the pitcher into a tin cup, wrung out a cloth in the wash basin, adjusted the window to pull a cross breeze through the stifling heat. Every movement was deliberate, economical, betraying nothing of the anger building in his chest, like steam in a sealed kettle. He'd seen this before. Different continent, different war. Same human capacity for cruelty. The Sand Creek Massacre had taught him what men became when they decided another group wasn't human enough to deserve mercy. He'd been ordered to participate, ordered to fire into lodges where women and children huddled, ordered to treat survival as rebellion, and rebellion as license for extermination. He'd refused. They'd court-martialed him for it. The scar on his left wrist, thin and white against sun-darkened skin, marked where they'd bound him during the flogging. 50 lashes for disobeying a direct order. They'd called it discipline. He called it the only choice he'd had to keep his humanity intact. The woman stirred her breathing evening out slightly. Elijah dampened the cloth again and pressed it gently to her forehead. She flinched at the contact but didn't pull away, as if the kindness confused her more than violence would have. Outside, the mare whinnied a sound of distress cutting through the afternoon stillness. Elijah stepped back onto the porch, scanning the horizon with the automatic vigilance of someone who'd learned that danger announced itself in the quiet spaces between safe moments. 3 riders appeared on the ridge silhouettes wavering in the heat shimmer. They moved without urgency, the lazy confidence of men who'd never learned to fear consequences. Elijah recognized them before they got close enough to identify faces. He knew them by reputation, by the stories that circulated through Crimson Ridge and the surrounding settlements, by the way decent people crossed the street to avoid them. Wade Harmon rode in front, broad-shouldered and red-faced, carrying in his bulk like a weapon. The kind of man who mistook cruelty for strength and used his father's name like a shield against accountability. Beside him, Clayton Reed slouched in his saddle, narrow-eyed and mean, the type who enjoyed hurting things weaker than himself. The third rider hung back slightly, Marcus Gibbs, younger than the other two, maybe 25-something, uncertain in his posture, that didn't quite match the company he kept. They stopped outside the fence line, dust settling around their horses' hooves. Wade leaned forward in his saddle, grinning like he'd just heard a joke only he understood. Well now, looks like our little Apache friend found herself a new protector. Elijah stood on the porch, arms loose at his sides, weight balanced. He didn't reach for the rifle propped inside the door frame, didn't need to yet. Sometimes the threat of violence deterred it. Sometimes it invited it. He'd learned to read which was which. She attacked us. Wade gestured vaguely toward Clayton and Marcus. We were just teaching her some manners when she ran off. That's our horse she stole too. Liar. The word hung in the air, simple and absolute. Clayton's hand drifted toward his holster. Marcus shifted in his saddle, looking anywhere but at Elijah. Wade's grin widened, showing teeth stained by tobacco. You calling me a liar, Stone? I'm calling what you said a lie. Whether that makes you a liar or just ignorant is your business. The insult landed with the precision Elijah intended. Wade's face darkened, the flush spreading from his collar to his hairline. Men like Wade functioned on a simple currency dominance territory, the ability to inflict humiliation without receiving it. Elijah had just publicly devalued that currency. That woman's a thief. Clayton's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd repeated the same lie enough times to believe it. She tried to steal Wade's property. We got a right to bring her in for justice. Justice. Elijah let the words sit between them for a moment, heavy with irony. The horse in that corral is injured. The woman was tied to my fence, left to die in the sun. That's not justice. That's just cruelty. You're trying to dress up in better clothes. She's Apache. Wade spat the word like it explained everything, justified everything, absolved everything. Around these parts, that's all the explanation the law needs. Not on my land, it isn't. The declaration shifted, something in the air, drew a line that everyone recognized, even if only Elijah was willing to defend it. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the yard in lazy spirals. Wade finally straightened in his saddle, adjusting his hat with theatrical slowness. You're making a mistake, Stone. My father's the territorial judge. He don't take kindly to folks who harbor criminals, especially when they're harboring them from white men trying to uphold order. Elijah said nothing. Sometimes silence carried more weight than argument. We'll be back. Wade turned his horse with a savage yank on the reins that made the animal toss its head. And when we come back, we're coming with authority. You think about that while you're playing nursemaid to a savage. They rode off, 3 figures dissolving back into heat shimmer and distance. Elijah watched until they disappeared completely, then scanned the horizon for another few minutes, making sure they weren't circling back. Only when he was satisfied did he return inside. The woman's eyes tracked him from the bed, fully alert now, despite her weakened state. She'd heard everything, the confrontation, the threats, the casual dehumanization that men like Wade wielded like a birthright. Why, her voice was stronger than before, sharpened by confusion and suspicion. Why would you risk trouble for me? Elijah pulled a chair closer to the bed, sitting so their eyes were level. Because leaving you tied to that fence wasn't an option I could live with. You don't know me. Don't need to. She studied him for a long moment, gaze traveling from his face to his hands to the scar on his wrist. That mark. You were punished. It wasn't a question. She recognized the signature of rope and violence the way trauma left its fingerprints on flesh. I disobeyed an order. What order? One that would have made me something I wasn't willing to become. Understanding flickered across her face, tentative, but real. She shifted on the bed, testing her body's limits. Pain crossed her features, quickly masked. The rope burns on her wrists wept clear fluid where skin had broken. Elijah stood moving to the small shelf where he kept medical supplies. Nothing fancy: whiskey for cleaning wounds, clean cloth for bandages, salve made from herbs a Navajo trader had sold him years ago. He'd learned field medicine the way most soldiers did, through necessity and the grim education of watching men die from infections that could have been prevented. This is going to hurt. It already hurts. Her response carried no self-pity, just observation. He cleaned the wounds with whiskey-dampened cloth, working with the careful efficiency of someone who knew pain was sometimes necessary to prevent worse pain later. She didn't flinch, didn't cry out, though her jaw clenched tight enough that he could see muscle jump beneath skin. "What's your name?" she hesitated, weighing the risk of that much vulnerability. "Ayanna, Elijah Stone." He finished wrapping her wrists in clean cloth, securing it with knots that would hold but not constrict. "You should rest. Those wounds will need days to heal properly." "I don't have days." Her eyes moved to the window, to the direction Wade and his men had disappeared. "They'll come back. You heard him. His father, I heard." Elijah returned the supplies to their shelf. "Wade Harmon's father might be a territorial judge, but this is still my land. I paid for it legal. Built it myself. They can't just take that. Can't they?" Bitterness edged her voice. "When was the last time law protected someone like me from someone like them?" The question had no good answer, and they both knew it. Elijah had seen enough of frontier justice to understand that law bent toward power, toward whiteness, toward men who had the territorial governor's ear, and the kind of money that made inconvenient truths disappear. "Why were you tied to that fence?" The question came out softer than he'd intended. "What happened?" Ayanna's expression shuttered, walls rising behind her eyes. "That's my business." "Fair enough." He stood, giving her space. "But if Wade and his friends come back, and they will, I need to know what I'm dealing with." She turned her face toward the window, watching the long shadows of late afternoon stretch across red earth. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of something heavier than physical pain. "That horse they claim is theirs. She belonged to my brother. Wade Harmon shot him 3 months ago during a dispute over grazing land. Killed him and took everything he had. The horse, his rifle, even the saddle our father made." Elijah felt the story settle into place, pieces clicking together with grim inevitability. "You tried to take her back. I didn't try. I succeeded until they caught me 2 miles from here." Ayanna's hands curled into fists, despite the pain it must have caused. "They tied me up, said they were going to make an example. Teach other Apaches what happens when we don't know our place." The casual brutality of it shouldn't have surprised him. Men like Wade collected grievances, like some men collected stamps, nurturing them until they justified whatever violence they'd already decided to commit. But understanding human capacity for cruelty didn't make confronting it any easier. "I'm sorry about your brother." "Sorry doesn't bring him back." She finally looked at him again, eyes bright with unshed tears and anger. "Nothing brings him back, but that mare. She's all I have left of him. The only proof he existed, that his life meant something." Outside, the injured horse whinnied again. Elijah moved to the window, watching the animal shift her weight, favoring the injured leg. The wrap he'd applied earlier needed changing. The joint needed proper care if there was any chance of recovery. "I can tend to her." He spoke without turning from the window. "Try to save the leg, at least." "Why would you do that?" Now Elijah did turn, meeting her skeptical gaze directly. "Because she matters to you. Because your brother mattered it. Because Wade Harmon doesn't get to erase people and pretend they never existed." Something shifted in Ayanna's expression. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first tentative step toward it. The kind of shift that happens when someone who's learned to expect cruelty encounters kindness instead and doesn't quite know how to process the dissonance. The sun dropped lower, painting the ridge in shades of copper and rust. Inside the cabin, shadows lengthened and deepened, softening the harsh angles of poverty-stricken furnishings. Elijah lit a lantern, the flame catching and steadying, pushing back darkness with fragile insistence. You should eat something. He moved toward the small kitchen area, such as it was a wood stove, a shelf with basic supplies, a table scarred by years of use. I've got beans, some dried meat, bread that's only a day old. Ayana pushed herself up slowly, testing her body's capacity for vertical. Her face drained of color with the effort, sweat beading along her hairline. Elijah took a half step toward her instinctive offer of assistance, but stopped when she shot him a warning glance. I can manage. She could not really, but he understood the need to try. Pride was sometimes the only currency left to people who'd been stripped of everything else. He busied himself at the stove, giving her space to struggle upright and make her way to the table without an audience. By the time the beans were heated and the bread sliced, she'd managed to lower herself into a chair. Sweat plastered her shirt to her back, but she was sitting upright under her own power, and that counted for something. Elijah set food in front of her, keeping portions modest. Someone who'd gone without food and water for as long as she had would need to ease back into eating. Too much too fast would make her sick. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the soft hiss of the lantern. Outside night settled over Crimson Ridge, bringing temperatures that dropped from punishing to merely uncomfortable. You said you disobeyed an order. Ayana's voice cut through the quiet. What order? Elijah set down his spoon, considering how much truth to offer. The memories sat in him like shrapnel pieces of horror, embedded too deep to remove, working their way to the surface at unexpected moments. I was a soldier, cavalry. We got sent to a Cheyenne and Arapaho village on Sand Creek. Told they were hostiles, insurgents, threat to settlers. He paused, the words bitter on his tongue. They weren't. They were mostly women, children, elderly, people trying to survive winter on land they'd been promised was theirs. Ayana had stopped eating, her attention fixed entirely on him. Our commanding officer ordered us to attack. Kill them all, burn the lodges, take no prisoners. Elijah's hands closed into fists on the table. I saw what we were being told to do, saw those faces, saw children. And I couldn't. I just couldn't. What happened? I refused to fire. Tried to convince others to stand down. He touched the scar on his wrist absently. They court-martialed me, called it cowardice, insubordination. They were right about the second part, at least. I was insubordinate. I'd do it again. And the scar punishment. 50 lashes, public flogging to make an example. After that, they discharged me dishonorably and sent me west to disappear. The military didn't want stories getting back about soldiers refusing orders, especially orders that came from men with political connections. So you became a blacksmith. I became whatever let me survive without becoming what they wanted to make me. Elijah picked up his spoon again, though his appetite had vanished. I shoe horses, I fix tools, I keep to myself. And I try to remember that refusing to participate in cruelty is sometimes the only victory available. Ayana absorbed this, her expression unreadable. After a long moment, she spoke, voice soft but steady. My brother's name was Karuk. He was 19. All he wanted was enough land to graze a few horses, make an honest living. She looked down at her hands, at the bandages wrapped around her wrists. Wade told him the grazing land was public range. But when Karuk brought his horses there, Wade claimed it was private property. Said my brother was trespassing. Threatened him. Did your brother leave? He tried. Gathered his horses, started to move them. Wade shot him in the back. Ayana's voice didn't waver, but her eyes shone with the terrible brightness of grief held too long. Then he took everything Karuk owned. Told people my brother was a thief who'd drawn on him first. Self-defense, he called it. And nobody questioned it. Would you? If you were white, if Wade Harmon's father could make your life hell with a word, she met his gaze evenly. The marshal didn't investigate. The territory didn't care. Kuruk was just another dead Apache, and dead Apaches don't threaten property values or business interests. Elijah had no counter-argument because there wasn't one. The truth she spoke was carved from experience, from watching her people pushed and hunted and killed for the crime of existing on land white settlers wanted. Treaties got broken. Promises turned to lies. And people like Wade Harmon did whatever they wanted because the system protected them. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, a child's bandage on a mortal wound. Stop apologizing. Ayana pushed back from the table, fatigue and pain catching up to her. You've done more than anyone else did. You cut the rope. You gave me water. You stood between me and them. That's already more than I had any right to expect from a white man. The assessment carried no malice, just the flat recitation of probabilities calculated through experience. She'd learned not to trust white men because white men had given her 1,000 reasons not to trust them. You should rest. Elijah stood collecting the plates. Tomorrow we'll need to figure out next steps. Wade will come back. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. I know. She moved toward the bed, each step a negotiation with her battered body. I'll leave before then. I won't bring that trouble to your door. You're in no condition to leave. I'll manage. Ayana lowered herself onto the bed, exhaustion pulling at her like gravity. I'd always manage. Elijah snuffed the lantern, leaving only the faint glow from the stove. Moonlight filtered through the window, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. He moved to the corner where he kept a bedroll, unrolling it on the floor near the forge room doorway. Stone. Her voice carried through the darkness, softer than before. Yeah, thank you. The words came reluctantly, as if she had to force them past some internal barrier, for not being like them. Elijah didn't respond immediately. What did you say to someone when they thanked you for bare minimum human decency? When they treated not being tortured or murdered as a gift rather than a baseline expectation? Try to sleep. Tomorrow's going to come whether we're ready or not. Silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the creak of settling wood and the distant howl of a coyote announcing its territory to the night. Elijah lay on the bedroll, staring at the ceiling, knowing sleep would be slow to come. He'd drawn a line today, told Wade Harmon and his friends that Ayana was under his protection, that his land was sanctuary, that their casual brutality stopped at his fence line. It was the right thing to do, the only thing he could do, and still recognize himself in the mirror. But right things often came with steep prices. Wade's threat hadn't been idle. His father being a territorial judge meant access to legal mechanisms that could destroy Elijah without anyone lifting a hand in violence. Property seizure, false accusations, the kind of bureaucratic cruelty that left no blood but buried people just as effectively. Elijah had money saved enough to start over somewhere else if it came to that. But this homestead represented 10 years of work of building something with his own hands, of proving to himself that the war hadn't broken him beyond repair. Losing it would mean more than losing property. It would mean losing the fragile proof that he could create instead of destroy. He rolled onto his side, watching moonlight patterns shift across the floor. In the bed near the window, Ayana's breathing had evened into sleep, or the pretense of it. Hard to tell which. People who'd spent enough time in danger learned to fake rest while staying alert, always listening for the sound of footsteps that might mean violence approaching. Outside, the injured mare made soft sounds in the corral, probably feeling the ache in her leg intensify as shock wore off. Tomorrow he'd need to examine it properly, determine if the damage was permanent or if time and care might restore function. Animals were easier than people in some ways. You could splint a broken leg, rest a sprained joint, and reasonable odds said they'd heal. People carried wounds that never fully closed. They learned to walk on broken pieces of themselves, adapted to trauma, like trees growing around barbed wire, forever shaped by what had hurt them. Sleep finally came thin and restless, populated by dreams of Sand Creek and courtrooms of fires, and faces he couldn't save, of orders he'd refused and the price that refusal had extracted. He woke twice before dawn, once to check the perimeter, once because Ayana cried out in her sleep, a wordless sound of distress that stopped before he could determine if she needed help. Morning arrived with the slow bleed of gray light across the horizon, stars fading like promises that couldn't survive contact with day. Elijah rose stiffly, joints protesting a night on hard floor, and moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision. Build fire, heat water, check the fence line, all the small rituals that marked the boundary between chaos and order. The mare was still favoring her injured leg when he checked the corral, but she took water and feed without fuss. Good signs. Panic could kill an injured animal faster than the injury itself if she was eating and drinking. Instinct said she had a chance. Inside, Ayana was already awake, sitting at the table with the stillness of someone conserving energy. She'd managed to rebraid her hair, though the effort had clearly cost her. The bandages on her wrists showed dark spots where blood had seeped through. Those need changing. She didn't argue, extending her hands palm up in silent permission. Elijah worked quickly, cleaning the wounds with whiskey-dampened cloth, applying more salve, rewrapping with fresh bandages. The swelling had decreased slightly, not much, but enough to suggest infection wasn't setting in yet. How does the mayor look? Better than yesterday? Worse than we'd like. He secured the last bandage and stepped back. She'll need weeks of rest before we know if the leg will heal right. Even then, she might always favor it. Ayana's jaw tightened. Wade did that to her. He wanted to hurt Kurok's horse the way he hurt Kurok. Cruelty for its own sake. Elijah moved to the stove, checking the fire. Some men need to break things to feel powerful. They mistake destruction for strength. And what do you need? The question caught him off guard. He considered it while measuring coffee grounds into the pot, adding water, setting it to boil. I need to know that I can still recognize the line between right and wrong, that the war didn't burn that out of me. Outside heat was already building, the sun climbing with relentless determination toward another punishing day. Elijah poured coffee into 2 tin cups, setting one in front of Ayana before taking his own to the window. The ridgeline shimmered in morning light, all red rock and scrub brush, beautiful in its harsh way. This land didn't apologize for what it was. It offered no illusions about survival being easy or guaranteed. People either adapted or they didn't. Nature was indifferent. Humans, though, humans had the capacity for choice, could decide whether to make survival harder or easier for others, could choose mercy over cruelty, protection over exploitation. That's what separated them from the desert that surrounded them. I have family. Ayana's voice pulled his attention from the window. An uncle, cousins. They're camped 3 days north, seasonal hunting grounds. If I could get a message to them, they'd come. Elijah finished the thought. And then what Wade would see that as an act of war. He'd rally the town, maybe call in territorial militia. He turned to face her. Is that what you want? No. The admission came reluctant but honest. My people have lost enough. I won't be the reason for more bloodshed. Then we need a different solution. What solution? She set down her cup with a soft clink. Wade wants me dead or disgraced. Either outcome satisfies him. There's no negotiating with that. Maybe not with Wade, but his father is a territorial judge. Official channels, legal remedies, rules that even men like Wade have to follow. Ayana laughed, a short, bitter sound. You believe that. You think courts protect people like me. I think courts are the only thing standing between frontier justice and mob violence. They're imperfect, hell. They're corrupt more often than not, but they're still better than letting men like Wade become the only law that matters. The coffee pot whistled on the stove, steam rising in aggressive bursts. Elijah poured more into both cups, the ritual giving him time to think through what he was proposing. If I file a formal complaint with the territorial marshal document, what Wade did get your testimony on record, that creates a paper trail, makes it harder for this to disappear, and makes me a target. Ayana met his eyes. You know that. The moment I testify, I'm painted as troublemaker. Savage, making false accusations against upstanding white citizens. Probably. He didn't insult her with false reassurance, but staying silent guarantees Wade faces no consequences. At least this way there's a chance. A chance isn't worth much when you're gambling your life. Fair point. He sat across from her, elbows on the table. So what do you want to do? Ayana was quiet for a long moment, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. The bandages on her wrists stood out stark white against her skin, visible proof of what staying silent had already cost her. I want Wade Harmon to pay for what he did to Kurok. I want him to know that killing my brother wasn't consequence-free. She looked up, eyes burning with the kind of controlled fury that came from grief denied proper expression. But I also want to survive. Those two things might not be compatible. They might not. Elijah acknowledged the hard truth of it, but giving up before we try guarantees Wade wins. Maybe Wade's already won. Maybe that's just how this world works. If that's true, then fighting back is still worth it, just to prove we're not content with how the world works. Outside, a hawk circled overhead wings, catching thermals, riding air currents with effortless grace. Predator and prey, victim and survivor. The desert understood both roles, made space for both, cared about neither. Inside the cabin, two people who'd learned survival from opposite sides of injustice tried to figure out if fighting back was courage or suicide, if hoping for justice was faith or delusion. The answer probably lay somewhere between. 3 days passed in careful routine, each hour building patterns that felt almost normal if you didn't look too closely at the tension threading through every action. Elijah worked the forge while Ayana recovered her strength, returning in increments, measured by how far she could walk before fatigue forced her to stop. First the porch, then the corral. By the third morning, she made it to the well and back without needing to rest halfway. The mare showed similar progress. The swelling in her leg decreased enough that she could put weight on it without trembling, though she still favored the injury with the caution of an animal that understood permanent damage when it felt it. Elijah changed the wrappings twice daily, checking for heat that might signal infection, watching how she responded when he manipulated the joint. Ayana watched these treatments with an intensity that went beyond concern for an animal. The mare represented her brother, the last tangible proof of his existence. If the horse recovered, something of Kurok survived. If she didn't, Wade's violence would have erased even that small legacy. On the fourth morning, Elijah found Ayana in the corral before dawn, standing beside the mare, forehead pressed against the animal's neck. Her shoulders shook with silent crying, the kind of grief that came when you finally felt safe enough to fall apart. He backed away before she noticed him, giving her privacy for the breakdown she'd been holding at bay through sheer will. Later, over breakfast, neither acknowledged what he'd witnessed. Some wounds needed darkness to drain properly. Exposing them to light too soon just drove the infection deeper. "Can you teach me to work iron?" The question came while Elijah scraped dried beans from the pot, his hands performing the task with automatic efficiency born from years of identical mornings. "Why do you want to learn?" Ayana set down her coffee, meeting his gaze directly. "Because I can't stay idle. Because watching you work makes me feel useless. Because maybe learning something from you is the closest I can come to repaying what you've done. You don't owe me anything." "I know, that's not what this is about." Elijah considered her for a long moment. Forge work required strength. She hadn't fully recovered a precision that took months to develop, and an understanding of metal that came from experience more than instruction. Teaching her would slow his own work, complicate his routine, introduce variables into the careful solitude he'd constructed. But solitude had been survival strategy, not preference. And something about the way she asked, not pleading, not desperate, just direct, made him recognize the request for what it really was. She needed purpose, needed to feel capable after days of being treated as fragile. "All right, basic work only, nothing that requires heavy hammering until your wrists fully heal." They spent the morning in the forge shed, Elijah demonstrating how to read heat in metal, how to recognize the moment when iron became malleable enough to shape, but not so soft it tore under pressure. Ayana absorbed instruction with focused intensity, asking questions that showed she was thinking several steps ahead. Her hands moved with unexpected grace despite the bandages still wrapped around her wrists. When he let her hold the tongs, positioning a horseshoe blank in the coals, she found the balance point immediately. Natural aptitude combined with determination made for fast learning. By midday, they'd produced 3 serviceable nails and 1 bent piece of metal that might charitably be called a hook. Not impressive by absolute standards, but better than most beginners managed in their first session. "You're a natural." Ayana examined the nails, turning them over in her palm with the satisfaction of someone who'd created something functional from raw material. "Kuruk used to say I had good hands, that I could make anything if I watched close enough and didn't give up. Sounds like he knew you well. Better than anyone." She set the nails carefully on the workbench, lined up with precision that spoke to internal order. "We were born 5 minutes apart. Twins. My mother said we came into the world holding hands, neither wanting to be first without the other." Elijah hadn't known she was a twin. The information shifted something in his understanding of her grief, not just losing a brother, but losing the person who'd shared her first breath, who'd existed in the world as her mirror and completion. "I'm sorry, stop apologizing." Her voice carried no anger, just weariness. "Every time you say that, it reminds me there's something to be sorry about. I'd rather focus on the nails we made than the brother I lost." Fair enough, they worked in companionable silence after that, the forge's heat pressing against them like a living thing. Outside, temperatures climbed past uncomfortable toward dangerous, the kind of heat that made thinking difficult and moving hazardous. But inside the forge shed heat served purpose. It transformed. It created. It bent rigid things into useful shapes. Elijah found himself explaining more than he'd intended, not just technique, but philosophy. How metal had memory, how forcing it too fast made it brittle, how patience and proper temperature produced strength that endured. He talked about respecting the material's nature instead of fighting it, about working with inherent properties rather than against them. Ayana listened with the focus of someone who heard more than surface meaning, who recognized that lessons about metalwork were also lessons about survival, about adapting without breaking, about finding strength through careful tempering rather than brute force. You're not just teaching me to make nails. No. He pulled a glowing rod from the coals, examining its color. I'm teaching you how I think about problems, how to take something raw and hostile and turn it into something useful, how to survive heat without losing yourself. And you learned this from working iron. I learned it from refusing to participate in massacre, from surviving punishment meant to break me, from discovering that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is stay soft enough to bend instead of shattering. The rod hissed when he plunged it into the quenching barrel, steam rising in angry clouds. Ayana watched the transformation metal going from red-hot to black, rigid structure, locked in by rapid cooling. What if you can't bend? What if staying soft just makes you easier to break? Then you find the right temperature. Hot enough to reshape yourself, cool enough to keep your core intact. It's a balance. You have to feel it more than know it. They worked until early afternoon when heat made continued effort dangerous. Elijah checked Ayana's bandages, noting that the wounds were healing cleanly, new skin forming over damaged tissue. Another week and she'd have full mobility back. Those scars would remain thin white lines she'd carry as permanent documentation of Wade's cruelty. Inside the cabin, they ate cold food and drank lukewarm water, neither willing to add more heat to an already sweltering space. Ayana moved to the window, watching dust devils spin across the open range with the hypnotic randomness of weather patterns that answered to nothing human. I should leave soon. The declaration came without preamble, delivered with the flat certainty of someone who'd made a decision they didn't particularly want to make, but recognized as necessary. Why? Because every day I stay puts you at greater risk. Because Wade hasn't come back yet, but he will. Because I'm strong enough now to travel, and the longer I wait, the more danger I bring to your door. Elijah set down his cup, choosing words carefully. You're healing. Another week and you'll be fully recovered. If you leave now in this heat with wounds still tender, I've survived worse. That's not the point. Then what is the point? She turned from the window, frustration breaking through her usual composure. You've done enough, more than enough. You don't owe me shelter or protection or anything else. I can disappear into the territory, make my way north to my uncle's camp, let this whole situation fade into forgotten history. And if Wade finds you between here and there, then I'll deal with it. Alone, injured, on foot since the mare can't carry weight yet. Ayana's jaw tightened. I won't let you sacrifice everything you've built because you feel responsible for me. This isn't about responsibility. Elijah stood, closing some of the distance between them. It's about refusing to let Wade win, about not teaching him that violence works, that he can tie people to fences and face zero consequences. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment I cut that rope. They stood facing each other, the cabin suddenly feeling much smaller. The air between them charged with something beyond argument. Ayana's eyes searched his face, looking for the angle, the self-interest, the hidden motive that would explain why anyone would voluntarily stand between her and danger. Why? The question came out almost whispered. Why does this matter so much to you? Elijah had been asking himself the same question for 4 days, examining his motivations with the ruthless honesty that military punishment had beaten into him. The easy answer was guilt. White guilt over historical atrocities, personal guilt over surviving, when others hadn't, soldier's guilt over the faces he couldn't save at Sand Creek. But beneath that surface guilt lived something more complicated, something about Ayana herself, her refusal to be diminished by trauma, her fierce competence, despite circumstances designed to destroy her, the way she'd learned to make nails despite hands that still hurt, the way she'd pushed herself to walk farther each day, despite exhaustion that would have justified surrender. She reminded him that survival was choice as much as circumstance, that people could endure horrors that should break them and come out the other side still recognizably human, still capable of learning, growing, trusting. because I've been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough to recognize the shape of it. And when I was there, nobody stood up for me. Nobody said the orders were wrong or the punishment was unjust. They just watched and told themselves I'd brought it on myself. That's not. Let me finish. His voice stayed level but firm. I don't want to be the person who watches and does nothing. I don't want to calculate the personal cost before deciding if someone deserves help. I want to be better than that. Maybe I'm not. Maybe this is just ego dressed up in moral language. But either way, I'd rather risk everything trying than do nothing and have to live with that instead. Ayana absorbed this, her expression shifting through several emotions too quick to name. Finally, she reached out and touched his forearm, fingertips light against sun-darkened skin. You're going to get hurt because of me. Probably. That doesn't bother you? It terrifies me. But not doing anything terrifies me more. Outside, hoofbeats approached multiple riders moving at a steady pace that suggested official business rather than hostile intent. Elijah's hand moved automatically toward the rifle, but he stopped himself. Grabbing the gun first and asking questions second was how escalation happened, how misunderstandings became violence. Ayana had already moved away from the window, positioning herself where she could see the door but wouldn't be immediately visible to anyone entering. Survival instincts learned young and reinforced through experience. Elijah stepped onto the porch, shading his eyes against brutal afternoon glare. 5 riders this time spread in a loose formation that spoke of practiced coordination. Sheriff Marcus Talbot rode in front, distinguished by the star pinned to his vest and the weary expression of someone performing a duty he'd rather avoid. Behind him, Deputy Lewis Warren sat his horse with the rigid posture of young authority, still believing the job was about right and wrong rather than managing competing interests. The other 3 riders Elijah didn't recognize, hired guns probably brought along to make the visit feel official and intimidating in equal measure. Stone, Sheriff. Talbot dismounted slowly, joints protesting the movement. He was maybe 55 gray, at the temples, carrying weight around his middle that spoke to too many years behind a desk and not enough in the saddle. His eyes held the particular exhaustion of men who'd seen justice fail often enough to stop expecting it to succeed. Got a complaint filed against you. Talbot pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, not bothering to open it. Wade Harmon says you're harboring a fugitive, a Apache woman who attacked him and stole his property. That's a lie, probably. Talbot's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile if it had more humor and less resignation. But a lie that's been filed officially still requires investigation. I need to bring her in for questioning. Let the territorial judge sort it out. The territorial judge is Wade's father, I'm aware. Talbot shifted his weight, glancing back at his men. I'm also aware this whole situation stinks worse than week-old corpse. But I got a job to do, and that job says bring her in. She stays here. Can't allow that. Talbot's voice carried genuine regret. Look, I know you're trying to do right, but you're making this harder than it has to be. Let me take her in, we'll get her statement on record, give her chance to tell her side. Maybe what? She gets a fair trial from the man whose son she's accusing of murder. Elijah descended the porch steps, putting himself between the riders and the cabin. You know how that ends, Marcus. The use of his first name was deliberate, an appeal to the person beneath the badge. Talbot and Elijah had history, not friendship exactly, but the kind of mutual respect that came from recognizing capability in others. Talbot had served in the war, 2 different regiment, but same darkness. They'd shared drinks once or twice, talked around the edges of trauma without quite touching it directly. I know how it looks. Talbot folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. But what's your alternative? Keep her here indefinitely. Wait for Wade to gather enough men to take what the law won't give him. I file charges against Wade. Put his attack on record. Force the territorial system to address his violence instead of her alleged theft. With what evidence? Her testimony. The rope burns on her wrists. The injured horse Wade claims is his but belonged to her murdered brother. Testimony from an Apache woman against a white man whose father controls the courts. Talbot shook his head. Stone, you know that won't go anywhere. Then the system's broken. No argument there. But working inside a broken system is still better than watching it collapse into complete lawlessness. At least this way there's paperwork, documentation, something for history to judge us by. History's judgment doesn't mean much when you're dead. Deputy Warren shifted in his saddle hand, drifting toward his weapon. The movement was subtle but deliberate, the kind of gesture meant to remind everyone that law came backed by force, that authority derived as much from the capacity for violence as from the legitimacy of institutions. Easy, Lewis. Talbot raised a hand without taking his eyes off Elijah. Nobody's drawing iron today. Then everybody leaves. Peacefully. Now. The three hired guns exchanged glances, calculating odds, reading the situation for potential profit or danger. They weren't invested in the outcome, just men paid to show force and reinforce authority through presence. If shooting started, they'd participate, but they weren't eager for it. Talbot studied Elijah for a long moment, weighing options against consequences. Finally, he sighed, shoulders slumping slightly. I'll give you 3 days. 3 days to either convince her to come in voluntarily or figure out some other solution. After that, I come back with more men and a warrant. And when I come back, Stone, I won't be asking. 3 days isn't enough time to... It's what I can give you, Talbot remounted with visible effort. Use it wisely. Talk to Territorial Marshal if you want. File your complaint. But understand that complaints take weeks to process and Wade's patience won't last that long. What's to stop Wade from coming back before then? Nothing. Which is why you should seriously consider letting her come in now, while I can still guarantee her safety in custody. Your custody won't protect her from a judge determined to find her guilty. Maybe not, but it's still better than being hunted. The riders turned their horses, dust rising around them as they departed. Elijah watched until they disappeared, then stood for several more minutes scanning the horizon for signs of anyone circling back or watching from concealment. Inside, Ayanna waited at the table, hands folded with deceptive calm. Her eyes tracked him as he entered, reading his expression for information about what came next. 3 days. Then they come back with a warrant and more men. I heard. She stood, moving to the window to watch the settling dust. So I have 3 days to disappear or turn myself in. Or we find a third option. What third option? She turned to face him, frustration and fear warring in her expression. You heard the sheriff. Filing charges won't work. Her testimony against Wade's with his father as judge. That's not justice, that's theater. Maybe, but Marcus was right about one thing: documentation matters. Even if the trial's predetermined, getting your statement on record means Wade's version isn't the only one in existence. And what good does that do me when I'm in jail or dead? Elijah had no good answer for that. The gap between principle and practicality yawned wide enough to swallow hope. Doing the right thing often meant accepting terrible outcomes while claiming moral high ground. Before he could respond, hoofbeats approached again, faster this time, urgent and uneven. Elijah grabbed the rifle, moving to the door with Ayanna right behind him. A single rider appeared, horse-lathered and gasping, pushed too hard in dangerous heat. The rider was young, maybe 16. Mexican descent, dressed in work clothes that suggested ranch hand or field laborer. He half fell from the saddle, stumbling toward the porch. Please. The boy's English carried a thick accent, words tumbling out between gasped breaths. You are Stone. The blacksmith I am. What's wrong, my father? He works at Harmon Ranch. Wade Harmon, he beats my father today. Says he steals but is lie. My father takes nothing. The boy's eyes welled with tears. He beats him very bad. My mother, she sends me to find help. Everyone says you are only white man who maybe helps us. Where is your father now? Still at ranch. Wade says if he leaves before work is finished, he calls sheriff. Says my father is thief and will go to jail. The boy wiped his face with a dirty sleeve. Please, my father, he is good man. He does nothing wrong. Elijah felt the situation's weight settle over him like physical pressure. Wade was escalating, testing boundaries, demonstrating that he could hurt people with impunity. The beating was message and warning combined. Challenge me, and watch everyone around you suffer. What's your name, Diego? And your father, Tomas Reyes. How bad are his injuries? Diego's face crumpled. He cannot stand. Blood comes from his mouth. Wade hits him with shovel. Many times. The boy's hand shook. My mother says maybe he dies if he not gets help soon. Ayanna moved beside Elijah, close enough that he could feel the tension radiating from her body. She understood the calculation happening, recognized the trap being laid. If Elijah went to help Tomas, he'd be leaving the homestead undefended. If he stayed, an innocent man might die from injuries inflicted to punish Elijah by proxy. You have to go. Elijah turned to her, seeing determination mixed with fear in her expression. She knew what she was suggesting, knew it meant being alone and vulnerable if Wade chose this moment to return. I can't leave you here unprotected. You can't let his father die because you're worried about me. Ayanna gripped his arm. Go. Help the man. I'll lock the cabin and keep the rifle. If Wade comes, you're trapped. Then I'll be trapped. But Tomas Reyes will be alive. That matters more. The logic was sound, but the risk made his stomach knot. Every instinct screamed at him not to divide his attention, not to walk into what might be a deliberate ambush, not to leave Ayanna alone when Wade had already demonstrated his willingness to hurt her. But Diego's father was dying, right now. While Elijah calculated risks and weighed hypotheticals against each other, a man bled out from injuries designed to send a message. How far is the Harmon Ranch? 8 miles, east toward the river. I'll need to take my horse. Elijah moved toward the corral mine, already running through what he'd need medical supplies. Water, possibly the wagon if Tomas couldn't ride. Are you strong enough to hold on behind me? Diego nodded vigorously. Ayanna had already moved to gather supplies, pulling bandages and whiskey from the shelf, wrapping them in cloth with efficient speed. When Elijah came back inside to collect them, she pressed the bundle into his hands along with a canteen. Be careful. Wade's expecting you to come. This might be exactly what he wants. I know. He secured the supplies to his saddle, checking the rifle's load before sliding it into the scabbard. Keep the door barred. If anyone comes, I know how to defend myself. Promise me you won't do anything stupid. She met his eyes. Same promise goes for you. There was no time for anything else. No more warnings, no contingency plans, no solutions to problems they couldn't predict. Elijah swung into the saddle, pulling Diego up behind him. The horse protested the extra weight briefly before settling. 3 days. Ayanna stood on the porch, backlit by the cabin's dim interior. I'll be here when you get back. He wanted to say something more, acknowledge the risk she was taking, the trust implicit in staying behind while he rode into potential ambush. But words felt inadequate, so he simply nodded and turned the horse east, pushing it into a pace that ate distance without killing the animal before they arrived. Behind him, Ayanna disappeared into the cabin. The sound of the heavy bar dropping into place reached him just before distance, and wind swallowed it completely. The ride to Harmon Ranch took 90 minutes, terrain rough enough that speed had to be balanced against not breaking the horse's legs in unseen hollows or arroyos that carved through the landscape like scars. Diego held tight, his arms locked around Elijah's waist, with the desperation of someone who'd already lost too much and couldn't bear losing more. They talked as they rode, Diego's accent thick, but his story clear. Tomas had worked at the Harmon Ranch for 6 years, reliable labor that kept him employed despite the casual prejudice that governed hiring practices. He'd never stolen, never shirked, never given Wade reason to single him out for punishment. Until yesterday, when Tomas had seen Wade beating the Apache woman's horse. He'd objected, not loudly, not confrontationally, just a simple statement that the animal hadn't deserved such treatment. Wade had laughed it off, told him to mind his business. This morning, Wade had accused Tomas of theft. Tools missing from the smithy, blame conveniently landing on the Mexican worker who dared question Wade's judgment. No proof required. Accusation was evidence enough when the accused lacked social protection. The beating had been public, performed in front of other ranch hands as demonstration and warning. This is what happens when you forget your place, when you think you can judge white men, when you believe you deserve dignity. We arrive. Diego's whispered announcement pulled Elijah from his thoughts. The Harmon Ranch spread across a shallow valley, buildings clustered around a main house that spoke of money and power, 2 stories painted white with a covered porch that wrapped 3 sides. Outbuildings that dotted the property: stables, storage sheds, bunkhouse for workers, a forge similar to Elijah's, but larger and better equipped. Men worked in various areas, but the tension was palpable, even from distance. Heads stayed down. Nobody lingered or chatted. Fear had carved stillness into the afternoon's rhythm. Diego pointed toward a small adobe structure set apart from the main buildings. Worker housing, probably where ranch hands lived when they couldn't afford property of their own. The door stood open, and even from outside, Elijah could hear the sound of a woman weeping. He dismounted, handing the reins to Diego. Where's Wade now in house? Diego's eyes were huge with fear. Please be quick. If he sees you, let me worry about Wade. Take care of the horse. Get him water. Elijah approached the adobe with the cautious awareness of someone entering hostile territory. Inside, the space was cramped but clean, sparse furniture, speaking to lives lived without excess. A woman knelt beside a man lying on a narrow cot, her hands pressed to his chest as if she could hold his life inside through sheer determination. Tomas Reyes looked worse than Diego had described. His face was a mask of purple and red. Both eyes swollen shut, nose clearly broken, lip split so badly that blood still seeped despite clotting. But the chest wounds concerned Elijah most, ragged gashes where the shovel's edge had caught ribs, the kind of impact that could splinter bone and puncture organs. Senor, the woman looked up, eyes red from crying. You are the blacksmith, the one who helps I am. Elijah knelt beside the cot, hands already moving over Tomas's injuries with the impersonal efficiency of field medicine. Can he breathe without pain? He breathes, but, she gestured helplessly. Blood. When he coughs, internal bleeding, possibly punctured lung. Neither diagnosis offered good prognosis without real medical care, the kind available in cities but not in remote ranches 8 miles from the nearest town. We need to move him, get him to a doctor. No doctor will see him. The woman's voice carried the flat certainty of experience. He is Mexican, poor. They say wait. They say come back tomorrow. Tomorrow he is dead. Then we don't wait. Elijah began checking the wounds more carefully, determining what could be bandaged versus what required immediate intervention. I have a wagon. We'll move him carefully, get him somewhere safe, find someone who will help. Wade Harmon. He will not allow this. The woman gripped Elijah's arm. He says if Tomas leaves, he calls sheriff. Says my husband is thief who runs from justice. Wade Harmon doesn't give a damn about justice. Elijah met her eyes. He wants control. Wants to punish your husband for seeing him hurt an animal and thinking that mattered. I won't let him. You risk much. Yeah, he pulled bandages from the bundle Ayana had prepared. I seem to be making a habit of that. Working quickly, Elijah cleaned what wounds he could and wrapped Tomas's chest to stabilize broken ribs. The man drifted in and out of consciousness, moaning, when pressure hit tender areas but unable to fully wake. Shock, pain, possibly brain injury. Hard to know without better assessment. Diego helped me get him into the wagon, but I sent the wagon back to town. Diego looked stricken. Only the horse. I ride your horse to come here. Elijah bit back frustration. Logistics he should have considered before leaving. No wagon meant improvising a travois or somehow getting Tomas into a saddle, neither option ideal for someone with chest injuries. We'll ride slow. You in front, Tomas, behind you, me behind, to keep him from falling. It's going to hurt him, but leaving him here kills him. They were maneuvering Tomas upright, him unconscious with pain, the effort drawing moans that sounded like they came from something dying when footsteps approached outside. Heavy boots on hard-packed dirt, unhurried and confident. Wade Harmon filled the doorway, blocking sunlight and smiling like he'd just won something valuable. Well, well, heard we had unexpected company. His eyes traveled from Elijah to Tomas to the woman still kneeling on the floor. Didn't realize our local blacksmith moonlighted as a thief. I'm not stealing anything. Tomas needs medical help. Tomas is an employee who's been accused of theft. That makes him my problem, not yours. Wade folded his arms, shoulders nearly touching both sides of the narrow doorframe. Sheriff's been notified. He'll be by tomorrow to sort this out proper. He'll be dead by tomorrow. Should have thought about that before he stole from me. You know he didn't steal anything. Elijah lowered Tomas back onto the cot, turning to face Wade fully. This is punishment for what he saw yesterday, for watching you beat an injured animal and having the audacity to say something about it. Wade's smile widened. Careful, Stone. You're making some serious accusations. Could be seen as slander. Truth's not slander. Your truth. Wade shrugged. My truth is I've got a dead worker in the morning and nobody to blame but himself. The threat was clear. Let Tomas die. Wade walks away clean, another tragedy blamed on the victim's poor judgment or criminal tendencies. No investigation, no accountability, just another brown body buried in forgotten ground, while white authority moved forward untouched. I'm taking him. Elijah positioned himself between Wade and the cot. You can explain to the sheriff why you tried to stop someone from getting medical help. Let's see how that looks in official reports. Wade's expression shifted amusement, giving way to calculation. You really want to die on this hill? Stone first the Apache whore, now this. You're making enemies faster than you can handle. Maybe. But I'll sleep fine knowing I didn't stand by while people died from preventable cruelty. Noble? Wade's voice dripped mockery. Stupid but noble. Tell you what, you can have him. Take him right now. But that Apache woman you're protecting? Consider my patience officially expired. End of the 3 days the sheriff gave you, I'm coming for her. With men. With ropes. And this time she won't just be tied to a fence. The threat landed with the weight of genuine promise. Wade had calculated the trade let Elijah save Tomas, now use that as excuse to escalate violence against Ayana later. Either way, he won something and Elijah lost. But saying no meant watching Tomas die. Get out of the way. Wade held his ground for another few seconds, letting tension build, demonstrating that moving was his choice rather than Elijah's command. Finally, he stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. Clock's ticking stone. 3 days. Then I come calling. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down with renewed vengeance, heat radiating from every surface until breathing felt like inhaling flame. Diego helped maneuver his father onto the horse, while Elijah steadied the man's weight. Tomas groaned but didn't regain consciousness, which was probably mercy given the pain he'd have felt otherwise. They rode back slowly, Elijah constantly checking that Tomas remained balanced, Diego's mother walking beside them when the terrain allowed. The woman's name was Carmen, and she prayed constantly soft Spanish words that asked God for protection, for healing, for justice in a world that seemed to offer none of those things to people who looked like her family. The journey took 3 hours, the horse picking, careful footing while carrying triple the load it should. Twice they stopped to readjust Tomas's position. Once to give him water that he couldn't swallow, liquid dribbling from slack mouth to mix with dirt and blood on his shirt. By the time Crimson Ridge homestead appeared on the horizon, twilight was bleeding into night stars, emerging with the abrupt clarity that came after brutal heat released its grip. Elijah's shoulders ached from maintaining Tomas's weight. His thighs burned from hours tensed in the saddle. But they'd made it. The cabin's windows glowed with lamplight, and as they approached, the door opened. Ayana stood silhouetted against interior warmth, rifle in her hands, body tense with the readiness of someone who'd spent hours on alert. Her shoulders dropped when she recognized Elijah, relief visible even from distance. Then she saw the injured man, and her expression shifted to determination. She set the rifle aside and moved to help. Inside, carefully. Together they maneuvered Tomas through the doorway and onto the bed Ayana had vacated days earlier. She'd already prepared water boiling on the stove, clean cloths laid out the cabin as ready as it could be for emergency medicine. Carmen hovered nearby, still praying, her hands wringing together with the anxious energy of someone who desperately needed to act, but had no action available. How bad? Ayana examined the chest wounds, fingers probing with the careful precision of someone who'd tended injuries before. Bad. Possibly broken ribs. Internal bleeding. He needs a doctor. The nearest doctor is in Copper Creek, 20 miles north. Ayana looked up, eyes meeting Elijah's. Even if we could move him that far, which would likely kill him, Dr. Harrison won't treat Mexicans after dark. Too much risk, he says. Then we treat him here, as best we can. They work through the night, taking turns monitoring Tomas's breathing, changing bandages when blood soaked through trickling water between cracked lips, in hopes that hydration might give his body fighting chance. Carmen and Diego sat against the wall, exhausted but unwilling to leave, maintaining vigil, with the endurance of people who'd learned that hope required physical presence. Around 2 in the morning, Tomas woke briefly, eyes unfocused and confused. Carmen rushed to his side, speaking rapid Spanish that Elijah couldn't follow, but recognized as love distilled into syllables. Tomas tried to respond, managed only a wet cough that brought up blood. Diego turned away, shoulders shaking with silent tears. By dawn, Tomas's breathing had stabilized slightly. Not good, but no longer actively deteriorating. The internal bleeding had either stopped or slowed enough that his body wasn't losing ground faster than it could recover. Small victory, fragile and tentative, but victory nonetheless. Elijah stepped outside as sunrise painted the ridge in shades of orange and gold. His body ached with the particular exhaustion that came from holding tension for hours without release. Behind him, the cabin held 5 people instead of 2, the homestead's careful isolation shattered by crisis and need. Ayanna joined him on the porch, moving with the quiet that suggested she'd learned to walk without disturbing sleeping wounded. She didn't speak immediately, just stood beside him watching light transform landscape, turning harsh terrain, beautiful through the simple fact of illumination. Wade meant what he said. Her voice was soft but certain. He's coming. End of the 3 days. I know. You saved Tomas. That matters. But it also means Wade won. He traded one man's life for an excuse to escalate violence against me. Elijah had reached the same conclusion hours ago. Wade had played the situation perfectly, appear magnanimous, by allowing rescue use that appearance to justify increased aggression later. No matter what Elijah chose, Wade engineered victory. We have 2 days to figure something else out. There's nothing else to figure out. Ayanna turned to face him. I leave tonight while I still can. Head north to my uncle's camp. You keep Tomas and his family safe, focus on that instead of me. And let Wade think he can terrorize people into compliance. He already can. The only question is how many people get hurt proving it. She was right, practically speaking. The smart play was cut losses, minimize casualties, accept that some battles couldn't be won. But accepting that meant accepting Wade's worldview, that power determined truth, that violence dictated justice, that people like Ayanna and Tomas and everyone else without social protection existed at the mercy of men like Wade Harmon. What if we don't run? What if we make him come, but on our terms? Ayanna studied him, searching for the plan behind the suggestion. What terms you're one man? He'll bring 10, 20. You can't fight that many. Not with guns, but maybe with witnesses, with documentation, with making it so public and so ugly that even Wade's father can't sweep it away. You want to turn this into theater. I want to turn it into something he can't control. Right now, Wade operates in shadows, ties women to fences in remote locations, beats workers where only other scared workers see. He depends on isolation to maintain deniability. Elijah gestured toward the horizon, toward the scattered homesteads and small settlements that dotted the territory. What happens if we remove that isolation? He kills us in front of witnesses instead of in private. Maybe. Or maybe having to explain mass violence in front of the territorial marshal force's different calculations makes him think twice about how far he's willing to go. And if you're wrong, then we're dead either way. At least this way someone documents it. Ayanna laughed short and bitter. You really believe that? You think history cares about one more dead Apache woman and the white man stupid enough to protect her? I think documented atrocities are harder to ignore than convenient disappearances. I think witnesses complicate narratives. I think sunlight might not stop Wade, but it makes him sweat while he does what he does. The sun climbed higher, heat already building toward another day of punishing temperatures. Inside, Carmen moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, tending her husband with the devotion of someone who'd accepted that love sometimes meant watching helplessly while death circled. 2 days. Ayanna's voice carried resignation mixed with defiance. 2 days to convince the world to care about justice when they've spent centuries proving they don't. 2 days to try on. They stood together on the porch, two people who'd learned different lessons from the same brutal teacher, trying to figure out if hope was courage or just delayed surrender. Inside, Tomas coughed wet and pained, but distinctly alive. And somehow that sound made belief feel slightly less impossible. The first day of the two remaining passed in careful orchestration. Elijah rode into Copper Creek at dawn, leaving Ayanna to watch over Tomas, while Carmen and Diego rested in the barn loft. The town sprawled across a wide intersection where two trade routes met, buildings clustered around commerce rather than community, general store, saloon, and office, assayer's shop, and the squat stone structure that housed both sheriff's office and territorial marshal's satellite station. Elijah found Marshal Raymond Pierce in his office, surrounded by paperwork that suggested bureaucracy followed the frontier with dogged persistence. Pierce was maybe 40, lean and weathered, carrying himself with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that taking sides often meant choosing which enemies to make. Stone. Pierce didn't look up from the ledger he was annotating. Heard you've been collecting trouble like some men collect stamps. Elijah closed the door, noting the marshal's hand resting near, but not on his holstered revolver. Calculated positioning meant to reassure while maintaining readiness. I need to file formal charges. Assault, attempted murder, theft. Multiple victims all pointing to Wade Harmon. Now Pierce looked up, pen still in hand. You understand what you're asking? I understand I'm asking for law to function the way it's supposed to. Supposed to and does are different animals. Pierce set down the pen with deliberate care. Wade Harmon's father is territorial Judge Samuel Harmon. Samuel Harmon drinks bourbon with the governor. Any charges filed against Wade get reviewed by Samuel before they reach trial. Then the system's corrupt, the system's practical. Pierce leaned back in his chair, wood creaking under the shift. Look, I don't like Wade any more than you do. He's a mean drunk with daddy's money protecting him from consequences. But filing charges that go nowhere just creates paperwork and makes enemies of powerful people. So I should do nothing. I'm saying pick battles you can win. Pierce's voice softened slightly. You want justice, move somewhere. Justice still exists. Out here we've got order, sometimes law, occasionally, and justice almost never. Elijah remained standing, refusing to make himself comfortable in a system, explaining why it couldn't help him. If I provide testimony, physical evidence, multiple witnesses, you're telling me that doesn't matter. I'm telling you it matters less than you think when the judge's son is the defendant. Pierce pulled a blank form from a drawer, sliding it across the desk. But if you want to file anyway, I'll take your statement. Won't stop what's coming, but at least you'll have tried. The resignation in Pierce's voice carried the weight of experience of watching jurisdiction become suggestion of learning that authority answered to power more than principle. Elijah had heard that same resignation in his commanding officer's voice at Sand Creek, the weary acceptance that orders came from men who'd never see the blood their decisions spilled. He took the form, began writing in careful script. Names, dates, descriptions of injuries, sequence of events. Ayanna tied to fence rope, burns documented. Kuruk's murder 3 months prior, witnessed by Ayanna horse stolen as trophy. Tomas beaten publicly, chest injuries, life-threatening witnesses available. Pattern of violence targeting non-white victims, pattern of impunity enabled by familial connections to judicial system. When he finished, the statement ran 3 pages. Pierce read it slowly, expression neutral, occasionally making small annotations in the margins. This is thorough, the marshal looked up. Also useless. You know that, right? Maybe. But now it exists. Now there's documentation that someone tried to stop this. Documentation gets filed, gets forgotten. Doesn't stop Wade from doing whatever Wade plans to do. Pierce folded the statement with precise creases. I'll submit this to territorial review. Process takes 6 to 8 weeks. In the meantime, you should seriously consider leaving. Take the Apache woman, take the Mexican family head somewhere Wade's reach doesn't extend. And if everyone who gets threatened just leaves, then Wade controls an empty territory, which honestly might be improvement over what we've got now. Elijah left the marshal's office with a receipt for his filing and zero faith that anything would come of it. The town moved around him with the busy indifference of commerce, shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks, freight wagons unloading goods, children chasing dogs through alleys. Life continuing because life always continued even when individual lives got crushed beneath systems designed to protect some people by sacrificing others. He stopped at the general store purchasing supplies with the careful calculation of someone preparing for siege. Extra ammunition, medical supplies, flour, beans, coffee. Enough for a week if they needed to hold position, not enough to suggest panic buying that might draw attention. The clerk, a nervous man named Simmons, who'd sold Elijah horseshoes and nails for 3 years, packed everything with exaggerated care while avoiding eye contact. Heard you got yourself mixed up in something complicated. Just helping people who need help. Wade Harmon's already been in twice this week asking questions. Who's buying what? Who's talking to who? Simmons lowered his voice. He's got folks scared, Stone. Not just the usual scared, the kind of scared that makes people do things they'll regret later. Like what? Like maybe mentioning you bought ammunition. Like maybe suggesting you're planning something violent. People protect themselves however they can, and if cooperating with Wade keeps them safe, well. Simmons met Elijah's eyes briefly, apology flickering in them. I'm just saying, watch yourself. Outside, Elijah loaded supplies onto his horse while scanning the street with the automatic vigilance of someone who'd learned that danger announced itself through small details. Unusual positioning forced casualness, the way people looked without appearing to look. 3 men loitered outside the saloon. their attention too carefully directed away from him to be genuine disinterest. Another two leaned against the land office, ostensibly in conversation, but positioned to watch the store's entrance. Wade's men, probably. Or just opportunists betting on Wade's eventual victory, establishing loyalty before it became currency. Elijah mounted and rode out slowly, not running but not lingering, projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. The men outside the saloon watched him go, one of them breaking away to head in the opposite direction at a quick walk, going to report his movements most likely, letting Wade know the timeline, the supplies purchased, the visible preparations. Information flowed toward power like water toward low ground. The ride back took 2 hours, sun climbing toward its apex heat building with the patient inevitability of weather that didn't care about human discomfort. Elijah's mind worked through scenarios, calculating odds, trying to find angles that didn't end in bloodshed. Pierce was right about one thing: fighting Wade directly meant dying. Even if Elijah won the immediate confrontation, Wade's father would ensure legal consequences that amounted to execution. The system protected its own, and Elijah wasn't part of that category. But making the fight public, documented, witnessed that changed variables. Not enough to guarantee victory, but enough to make cost-benefit analysis more complicated for Wade. Violence in shadows was easy to justify or ignore. Violence in daylight, with names and faces attached with victims who had advocates with evidence that couldn't be disappeared, that required different calculations. Maybe it wouldn't stop Wade, but it might slow him down, might force him to think twice, might create space for alternatives to emerge. Or it might just get everyone killed more publicly. The homestead appeared unchanged from distance, but as Elijah drew closer, he noticed details that hadn't been there before. Someone had reinforced the fence near the gate, adding extra support that would make it harder to simply ride through. The barn door had been repositioned to provide better sight lines toward approaching riders. Small improvements, tactical adjustments made by someone who understood defensive positioning. Ayanna emerged from the cabin as he dismounted, moving with the recovered strength of someone who'd decided pain was insufficient reason to stop functioning. Her wrists still carried bandages, but lighter ones now, white cloth stark against her skin. Tomas is awake, talking some. Carmen thinks he'll live, though he won't be working for weeks. That's good news. Only good news we're likely to get. She helped him unload supplies, hands moving with practiced efficiency. How did things go in town? About like expected. Filed charges. Marshall said they were useless. General store clerk warned me Wade's gathering information. Felt like I was being watched the whole time. You probably were. Ayanna carried a sack of flour toward the cabin. Wade's making sure everyone knows you're a problem, turning you into example before he even does anything. Psychology works better than violence sometimes. Inside, Tomas sat propped against the wall chest, wrapped in fresh bandages, face still swollen but conscious and alert. Carmen hovered nearby, spooning broth into him with the fierce devotion of someone who'd watched death circle and now refused to let it land. Diego sat in the corner, cleaning a rifle that Elijah recognized as his own. Hope you don't mind, Diego's voice carried embarrassment. I find in barn, think maybe I should learn in case. In case of what? In case men come who want to hurt my father more. Elijah took the rifle, gently checked the mechanism, noted that Diego had cleaned it competently despite clearly having limited experience. The boy had learned by watching, absorbed technique through observation in the way people did when formal instruction wasn't available. You know how to shoot? No, senor. But I learn fast if you teach me. The request was reasonable given circumstances, but teaching a 16-year-old to use weapons meant accepting that violence had already expanded to include him, that the sanctuary Elijah had tried to create was becoming armed camp, that protection required militarization. But not teaching him meant leaving him helpless if the worst happened. All right, tonight after dark we'll do basic instruction. But understand using a gun changes things. Can't take back pulling a trigger. I understand. Diego met his eyes. My father almost dies because Wade Harmon decides he is nothing. I will not be nothing. I will not let my father be nothing. If that means learning to shoot, I learn. Carmen said something in rapid Spanish voice, sharp with maternal fear. Diego responded in kind, the exchange heated but brief. Finally, Carmen nodded defeat and acceptance warring in her expression. She says I am too young for this violence. Tomas's voice came rough but clear, each word an effort. I tell her our son grows up fast because the world gives no choice. Elijah had no argument for that. The frontier aged people in ways that had nothing to do with years lived and everything to do with horrors witnessed. Diego had already seen his father beaten nearly to death for the crime of objecting to animal cruelty. Innocence had become luxury this family couldn't afford. Rest. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes next. Outside afternoons stretched toward evening, shadows lengthening as temperature moderated from intolerable to merely oppressive. Ayana worked at the forge, demonstrating that she'd continued practicing during his absence. The nails she produced weren't perfect, but they were functional, straight, properly headed, good enough for purpose. You've improved. Turns out I like making things. Her smile was brief but genuine. Better than being helpless. Better than waiting for men to decide what happens to me. They worked side by side until dark, the forge's heat almost welcome, as night brought its cooling relief. Elijah taught her more advanced techniques, how to draw out metal for hinges, how to create the specific temper needed for different tools, how to read the color spectrum of heated iron to know exactly when it was ready for shaping. Teaching felt like investment in future, like believing there would be time for her to use these skills. Optimism masquerading as instruction. After dark, they took Diego to the ridge behind the homestead far enough that gunshots wouldn't immediately announce themselves to anyone passing nearby. Elijah started with basics: how to hold the rifle, how to sight, how to breathe through the shot, how to accept recoil without flinching. Diego absorbed everything with intense concentration, the kind of focus that came from understanding this wasn't sport or entertainment, but survival skill. When he finally fired his first shot, missing the target by 3 feet, he didn't make excuses. Just adjusted, tried again, narrowed the miss to 2 feet. By the 10th shot, he was hitting within the target area. Not center mass, but enough to demonstrate capability if properly threatened. You're doing good. Elijah reloaded the rifle. Remember, though, shooting at wood is different from shooting at people. People shoot back, people bleed, people die, and you have to live with all of that afterward. I know. Diego's voice was steady. But living with that is better than living with doing nothing while bad men hurt my family. The logic was sound, even if the conclusion was terrible. Elijah had made similar calculations at Sand Creek, weighed participation against conscience, chosen conscience, and paid with his back carved bloody. Would he make the same choice again? Yes. Did that make it right? Hard to say. They returned to the cabin near midnight, exhaustion pulling at all of them. Carmen had prepared simple food, beans and tortillas, coffee that was more water than grounds, but still warm and welcome. They ate in contemplative silence, the kind that settled over people who'd accepted danger but hadn't yet faced it. Tomas managed to sit at the table, each movement careful but determined. His face had begun healing, swelling, decreasing enough that he could open one eye partially. The other remained sealed shut, probably would for days yet. Stone. His voice carried the rasp of damaged throat. Why you do this? Risk everything for people you not even know. Because leaving you to die wasn't something I could live with, but we are nothing to you, Mexican workers, Apache woman. We are the people this territory says not matter. Elijah set down his cup, considering how to articulate something he didn't fully understand himself. When I was in the army, I watched men I respected follow orders that turned them into monsters. Watched them justify atrocity by saying they were just following command, that responsibility lived above them, that they were just instruments of policy. Tomas listened intently, his working eye fixed on Elijah's face. I refused those orders, got punished for it, got thrown out. For years I thought that made me a coward, that real courage would have meant finding a way to stop it, not just refusing to participate. Elijah paused, old shame and old pride mixing uncomfortably. But lately I've been thinking maybe refusing is its own kind of resistance. Maybe saying no when everyone else says yes is how you keep from becoming what you hate. And we are your way of saying no. You're people who deserve to live without being terrorized. Helping you isn't about redemption or courage or any of that noble garbage. It's just the minimum requirement for staying human. Tomas absorbed this, then nodded slowly. In my village, we have saying, El que no vive para servir, no serve para vivir. He who doesn't live to serve doesn't serve to live. You understand this even if you not say it same way. Carmen touched her husband's hand, pride and fear mixing in her expression. Whatever happened next, at least they faced it together. At least they'd been given chance to choose resistance over submission. That night, Elijah took first watch while others slept. He sat on the porch rifle across his lap, scanning darkness for movement that didn't belong. Stars wheeled overhead with indifferent brilliance, mapping patterns that predated human conflict and would outlast it. Somewhere out there, Wade was planning, gathering men, calculating approach, deciding how much violence to deploy and how publicly to display it. The deadline was tomorrow, one day left of Sheriff Talbot's grace period, one day before official authority arrived with the warrants and weight of law behind it. Elijah had documented everything, created paper trail, positioned witnesses. But paper didn't stop bullets. Witnesses didn't prevent massacre. Sometimes preparation just meant dying with better organization. Movement near the barn pulled his attention. Ayanna emerged from shadows, moving toward the porch with the deliberate quiet of someone who'd learned not to startle armed people in darkness. Can't sleep seems pointless. She sat beside him, close enough that shoulders almost touched. Tomorrow or the next day, Wade comes. Sleep won't change that. Might make you sharper when he does. Might. She stared at the horizon where starlight met earth in uncertain border. Or might just mean dying rested instead of tired. They sat in silence for several minutes, the kind of quiet that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Two people who'd moved past the need to fill every moment with words. When I was young, Ayanna spoke suddenly. My grandmother told me about the wars. The real wars before white soldiers, before broken treaties. Wars between tribes over territory and resources and old grievances. She said our people understood warfare as ritual. You fought to count coup, to demonstrate courage, to settle disputes. But you didn't fight to exterminate. Didn't fight to erase other people from existence. What changed white warfare arrived. The kind that says winning means complete destruction, means taking everything until nothing remains of who you fought. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping arms around them. My grandmother said we tried to understand that mindset, tried to negotiate like it was just different form of counting coup. By the time we realized extermination was the actual goal, we'd already lost too much to recover. Elijah thought about Sand Creek, about orders that specified killing everyone, about commanding officers who viewed anything short of genocide as failure. Ayanna's grandmother had been right. White warfare wasn't about honor or settling disputes. It was about erasing alternatives to white presence, about making the land safe for settlement by eliminating anyone who'd lived there first. I'm sorry. Stop apologizing. Her voice carried exhaustion but not anger. You didn't create this. You just inherited a debt. Same as I inherited trauma from massacres I didn't personally survive. We're both living in wreckage of decisions made before we were born. Doesn't mean we can't try to build something different. Maybe. She leaned slightly closer, head resting against his shoulder with tentative trust. Or maybe we're just two people trying to survive long enough to prove we existed. Her weight against him felt significant, not sexual but intimate. In deeper way, the vulnerability of someone who'd learned not to trust physical proximity, deciding to risk it anyway. Elijah remained still, afraid movement would break the moment, would remind her of all the reasons guarding herself made sense. Why did you really cut that rope? Not the noble answer, the real one. The question caught him off guard. He'd been telling himself the noble answer so long, he'd almost believed it was the whole truth. But underneath lay something messier, more selfish. Because I was tired of being the person who did nothing. Because after Sand Creek, after the court-martial, after getting exiled out here, I started wondering if the punishment was worse than the crime. If maybe I should have just followed orders, participated in massacre, kept my mouth shut and my back unscarred. And then seeing you tied to that fence reminded me why I refused in the first place. Reminded me that some things are worse than punishment. That becoming the person who tortures and kills and calls it duty, that's the real death. Everything else is just pain. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then softly, thank you for that. For being honest instead of just noble. They stayed like that until Ayanna's watch started at 2 in the morning. Positions reversed, Elijah inside, trying to sleep while she maintained vigil outside. He lay on his bedroll, staring at ceiling boards, listening to small sounds of cabin settling, Carmen's soft snoring, Tomas's irregular breathing, Diego shifting restlessly. Tomorrow was the last day. After that, Sheriff Talbot returned with warrant and men forcing choices nobody wanted to make. Surrender Ayanna to custody, that probably meant death. Fight against legal authority, becoming outlaws in process. run abandoning everything built here, proving that Wade's violence worked. No good options, just terrible choices ranked by degrees of failure. Sleep came eventually thin and troubled, populated by dreams of courtrooms that morphed into battlefields judges who wore cavalry uniforms, gavels that became rifles. He woke before dawn, unrested but functional body trained by military experience to operate on insufficient sleep. The last day began with oppressive normalcy. Breakfast cooked, coffee brewed. Tomas insisted on sitting up on trying to move around despite pain that made his face gray. Carmen and Diego worked at small tasks, mending clothes, organizing supplies, maintaining routine because routine was shield against fear. Elijah worked the forge filling orders that wouldn't be picked up, creating inventory nobody had requested. The work itself mattered less than the doing the hammer strikes that marked time, the transformation of raw material into useful objects. Creation as counterpoint to destruction. Around mid-morning, a rider appeared, single horse moving at steady pace rather than aggressive charge. Elijah reached for the rifle, but something about the rider's posture suggested civilian rather than threat. As the figure drew closer, details emerged. Young man, maybe 23, wearing clothes that marked him as educated, pressed trousers, collared shirt vest, despite heat. He carried saddlebags stuffed with papers, rode with the awkward seat of someone more comfortable with books than horses. The rider stopped at respectful distance from the fence, raising both hands to show they were empty. Mr. Stone. My name is William Ashford. I'm a journalist with the Territorial Chronicle out of Phoenix. I was hoping we could talk. A journalist. Elijah hadn't anticipated that. Variable hadn't considered that documenting events might include actual press coverage. The Chronicle was legitimate publication, small but respected, known for occasionally printing stories that embarrassed territorial government. What do you want to talk about? I've been investigating Wade Harmon for 3 months, following reports of violence against Mexican and Native populations, documenting patterns of harassment and assault, trying to build a comprehensive case. Ashford dismounted carefully, leaving his horse tied outside the fence. Your filing with Marshal Pierce came across my desk this morning. I'd like to hear your account directly. Elijah studied the young man, noting details, ink stains on his fingers, calluses from pen rather than labor, the earnest intensity of someone who still believed journalism mattered, that exposing truth created change. Naive, probably. But naivete backed by legitimate publication could still accomplish things cynicism couldn't. Come inside. Talk to people who've experienced Wade's violence firsthand. But understand publishing this might make you a target too. I understand. Ashford followed him toward the cabin. I'm already a target. Wade's father tried to have me fired twice. Got my editor threatened with libel suits. But my publisher believes in what we're doing, believes some stories need telling, regardless of who they upset. Inside, Ashford spent 3 hours interviewing everyone. Ayanna described being tied to the fence, her brother's murder, the systematic theft of her family's property. Tomas recounted the beating. Multiple witnesses present Wade's explicit statement that objecting to animal cruelty deserved punishment. Carmen added her perspective, Diego his. Ashford wrote everything down in shorthand, occasionally asking clarifying questions, building narrative from multiple perspectives. When he finished, his notebook contained documentation more thorough than anything Elijah had filed with the marshal. This is substantial. Ashford closed the notebook carefully. More than enough for a full investigative piece. I'll need to verify some details, cross-reference with other reports I've gathered, but I can have this published within a week. Will it matter? Yana's voice carried skepticism. Will people care that an Apache woman and a Mexican family got hurt by a judge's son? Honestly, Ashford met her gaze. Probably not most people, but some people will care. Enough people that it creates political pressure. Enough that Wade's father has to respond, has to acknowledge accusations publicly, rather than burying them quietly. And then what happens to us? Diego spoke from his corner. You write story, make Wade angry. Then you go back to Phoenix, and we stay here with angry Wade. That's valid concern. Ashford didn't patronize the boy. I can't guarantee your safety. Can't promise this ends well. What I can promise is that your story gets told, that Wade's pattern of violence becomes public record, that future historians will know this happened and know who was responsible. Future historians don't help us now. No, they don't. Ashford stood gathering his materials. But present-day readers might. Press coverage changes calculations. Makes violence more costly because it can't be denied. forces people to choose sides instead of pretending neutrality. After Ashford left, promising to return with published peace, promising to maintain contact, promising to document whatever happened next, the cabin settled into uneasy waiting. They'd done everything possible to prepare. Filed charges, gathered witnesses, involved press, created paper trail that couldn't be easily disappeared. But paper didn't stop bullets. Afternoon stretched toward evening heat, finally beginning to break shadows lengthening across red earth. Elijah sat on the porch rifle nearby, watching the ridge where riders would appear if they came tonight. Beside him, Ayanna cleaned her own rifle, the one Elijah had given her, shown her how to use, made her practice until muscle memory replaced thought. She worked with methodical care, checking mechanism, loading cartridges, preparing for possibility neither wanted to acknowledge. If it comes to fighting, Ayanna spoke without looking at him, you should let them take me. Don't die for this. Not happening. Stone, don't. He cut her off, voice firm. We're past the point where surrender solves anything. Wade wants you dead or broken. Giving him that doesn't save anyone, just teaches him violence works, encourages him to use it more. So we all die together. That's the better option. We all make a stand together. Show Wade some people can't be terrorized. Maybe we survive it. Maybe we don't. But either way, we don't surrender to cruelty just because cruelty has more guns. Ayanna set down the rifle, turning to face him fully. You really believe that? That dying while refusing to submit is victory? I believe some things are worse than death. Becoming the person who abandons others to save himself, that's worse. Learning to live with that knowledge, that's worse. He met her eyes. I'd rather die with clear conscience than survive with guilty one. That's very noble. Very stupid. But noble. Probably. He allowed himself a small smile. But at this point, stupid noble is all I've got left. They sat together as sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple beauty, indifferent to human conflict unfolding beneath it. Inside the cabin, Carmen sang softly in Spanish lullaby, or prayer, or both. Diego checked and rechecked his rifle. Tomas breathed with the steady determination of someone who'd decided pain wouldn't stop him from defending his family if necessary. Elijah found himself thinking about Sand Creek again, about the choice he'd made that cost him everything and nothing. Everything material. Career reputation, the security of institutional belonging. Nothing essential integrity, humanity, the ability to recognize himself in the mirror. He'd been 24, then young enough to believe righteousness was sufficient protection. The flogging had taught him otherwise carved education into his back. In 50 strikes, demonstrated that virtue didn't prevent suffering and often invited it. But here he was, a decade later, making similar choice with similar odds, still believing that some lines couldn't be crossed regardless of cost. Maybe that was growth, maybe it was just stubbornness. Hard to distinguish between the two, when consequence was identical either way. Darkness fell completely, stars emerging with their usual brilliant indifference. No riders appeared. No sounds disturbed the night except wind and distant coyote song. They maintained watch and shifts, each person taking 3 hours rotating through positions that kept someone alert at all times. Elijah's shift came near dawn, that liminal hour when night hadn't quite released its grip, but day was already bleeding at the edges. He sat in the pre-light grayness mind, drifting between alertness and memory present and past flowing together in exhaustion-driven fusion. The sound came first, hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. Elijah counted silently. 8 horses at least, maybe 10, approaching from the east, where the road from Copper Creek connected to his property. He woke the cabin without raising voice, a touch on shoulders sufficient to bring everyone alert. Trained response practiced the night before, everyone moving to assigned positions. Diego to the loft window. Carmen and Tomas behind overturned table. Ayanna beside the door where she could see but not be immediately visible. Elijah stepped onto the porch rifle, held casually but ready, body position to present neither threat nor submission. Leadership meant being visible, being the first target, absorbing attention so others had opportunity to act if necessary. The riders materialized from dawn's gray light like ghosts gaining substance. 10 men, just as he'd counted. Sheriff Talbot at the front, looking older and more tired than 3 days ago. Deputy Warren beside him, young face set with the determination of someone compensating for uncertainty. Behind them, 8 riders that Elijah recognized from town, not quite a posse, more like audience, come to witness conclusion. And in the middle of the group, sitting his horse with satisfied arrogance, Wade Harmon smiled like a man who'd already won. Morning Stone, Talbot's voice carried across the distance. Deadline's up. Time to settle this. Nothing to settle. She stays here. Can't allow that. Talbot dismounted the movement, slow and heavy man carrying weight that had nothing to do with physical mass. I've got a warrant for the Apache woman's arrest, signed by Territorial Judge Samuel Harmon. Charges include theft, assault, and resisting lawful authority, signed by Wade's father. Conflict of interest. Law's the law regardless of who signs it. Talbot's face showed genuine regret. You know I don't want this, but I've got a job. That job says bring her in. Behind Elijah, the cabin door opened slightly. Ayanna stepped onto the porch, moving to stand beside him, despite his gesture for her to stay inside. She'd made her choice, face this directly rather than hide while others negotiated her fate. I'm here, her voice carried across the yard with clear strength. If you want me here, I am. Wade urged his horse forward, grin widening. That's real convenient. Saves us the trouble of dragging you out. Touch her and you'll regret it. Elijah's words came flat. No bluster, just statement of fact. Big talk from one man. Wade gestured to the riders behind him. I count 10 of us. You really think you can stop all of us? Don't have to stop all of you. Just have to make sure you're first to die. The threat shifted something in Wade's expression, confidence faltering briefly before reasserting itself. He glanced at his father's warrant, at Talbot, at the men backing him up, recalculating odds now that someone had explicitly promised his death. Sheriff, you going to let him threaten me like that? Talbot ignored Wade, keeping his attention on Elijah. This doesn't have to get ugly. Let me take her in. She gets her day in court. Judge hears both sides. Law sorts it out proper. We both know how that court date ends. Her word against Wade's, with Wade's father presiding. That's not law. That's theater. Maybe, but it's theater with rules, structure, better than what happens if you force this into violence. Talbot took a step closer. Think about the people in that cabin. You really want them caught in crossfire because you're too stubborn to accept reality. The argument was calculated, designed to weaponize Elijah's conscience, turn his protectiveness against him. And it worked, at least partially. Fighting here meant Carmen Tomas Diego exposed to violence meant for others, meant turning his homestead into battlefield where people who'd sought sanctuary got killed in someone else's war. But surrendering meant abandoning Ayanna to injustice, teaching Wade that threats worked, validating violence as effective strategy. No good choices, just terrible options ranked by cost. I'll go. Ayanna's voice cut through his calculation. I'll go with the sheriff, face whatever court decides. But I want 3 things documented first. Talbot paused. What 3 things? 1. My testimony gets recorded by the journalist William Ashford. He's already interviewed me, but I want formal statement for the record before I go into custody. That can be arranged. 2. You guarantee my safety while in custody. No accidents, no convenient escapes that end in shooting. I make it to trial alive and unharmed. I guarantee that personally. Talbot met her eyes. You have my word. 3 Stone doesn't get charged as accessory or accomplice. He helped an injured woman. That's not crime, and I won't let him be punished for it. Wade erupted from his saddle. The hell with that. He's been harboring fugitive, obstructing justice, threatening law enforcement. I'm not charging Stone. Talbot's voice cut through Wade's protests. He filed legitimate complaint, same as is his right. Everything he did was legal, if inconvenient. Your father signed a warrant for the Apache woman. Didn't say anything about the blacksmith. Talbot turned back to Ayanna. You have my word. All 3 conditions met. Now will you come peacefully? Ayanna looked at Elijah, something complex passing between them. Apology, resignation, defiance. Trust all mixed together. Then she nodded. I'll come. But if your word proves worthless, Sheriff Stone isn't the only one you should worry about. My people remember who betrays us, and we're very patient about collecting debts. The threat was quiet but absolute. Talbot absorbed it with a small nod and acknowledging the terms being set even as he enforced custody. Elijah wanted to protest, wanted to fight, wanted to refuse this outcome, even though Ayanna had chosen it. But forcing his protection on her would just strip her of the agency she'd fought to reclaim. So he stayed silent, watching as Talbot secured her hands in front, rather than behind small, mercy acknowledgement that she wasn't considered violent threat. Wade looked disappointed, clearly having hope for resistance that would justify escalated violence. But with sheriff enforcing law properly with witnesses present, with journalists promised documentation, the situation had become too public for the kind of casual brutality he preferred. "We'll be going now." Talbot helped Ayanna onto a spare horse. "Trial's set for 3 days from now. You'll want to be there, Stone. Testify if called. I'll be there." The group turned to leave, dust rising around the horses as they moved back toward the road. Elijah stood on his porch rifle, still in hand, watching until they disappeared from view. Behind him, the cabin door opened and Carmen emerged, Diego beside her. "Why you let them take her?" Diego's voice carried confusion and accusation. "We have guns. We could fight. Fighting would have gotten people killed, probably including her." Elijah lowered the rifle. "This way she faces court, has chance to tell her story publicly. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but at least nobody dies today." "You believe that?" "That court gives her chance, no. But I believe fighting here would have guaranteed bad outcome. This way there's at least slim chance something unexpected happens. Slim chance isn't much hope. It's the hope we've got." They stood together, watching empty horizon, three people who'd thrown themselves between cruelty and its victims, who'd discovered that sometimes protecting others meant accepting terrible compromises, that righteousness didn't guarantee victory and often invited defeat. But they'd tried. That had to count for something, even if it counted for nothing at all. The 3 days before trial passed in suspended time hours that felt simultaneously endless and too brief. Elijah worked the forge with mechanical precision, creating horseshoes nobody needed, repairing tools nobody requested, keeping hands busy because idle hands meant idle mind, and idle mind meant imagining all the ways the trial could end in disaster. Tomas recovered enough to walk short distances, his chest still wrapped but breathing easier. Carmen maintained the cabin with fierce efficiency, cooking meals that nobody ate much of, cleaning spaces, already clean, channeling anxiety into action. Diego practiced with the rifle each evening, improving but still young, still learning that competence with weapons didn't translate to readiness for violence. William Ashford returned on the second day carrying printed copies of his article. The piece ran 4 full columns in the Territorial Chronicle, headline, "Stark and Uncompromising. Pattern of Violence Judge's Son, Accused of Systematic Brutality Against Minorities." The text laid out everything: Karuk's murder, the stolen horse, Ayanna tied to fence, Tomas beaten for objecting to cruelty. Names, dates, documented injuries, multiple witness statements. "This is good work." Elijah read it twice, noting how Ashford had woven individual incidents into broader pattern, demonstrating systematic behavior rather than isolated events. "Will it make a difference?" "Already has." Ashford pointed to a secondary article on the facing page. "Territorial Governor's Office issued statement this morning. Says they're monitoring the trial closely, ensuring justice is served without prejudice." That's politician speak for "we're watching, and it better not look too corrupt." But they're still letting Wade's father preside, can't remove a territorial judge without cause. Process takes months, but public scrutiny changes calculations, makes it harder to railroad someone when everyone's watching. Ashford folded the papers carefully. "I'll be at the trial, taking notes. Whatever happens gets documented. And if documentation doesn't matter, then at least we tried. Sometimes trying is all you get." The morning of the trial arrived with cloudless sky and temperatures already climbing toward punishing. Elijah dressed carefully, his one good shirt cleaned and pressed by Carmen boots, polished to respectability, hair trimmed by Diego, who'd discovered unexpected skill with scissors. Not vanity, just understanding that appearance mattered in spaces where authority judged credibility by surface presentation. Tomas insisted on coming, despite Carmen's protests. "I testify. My words matter too." He moved slowly, each step negotiated with pain but determined. "Wade beats me for being Mexican. Who objects? Court needs to see what his objections do." They rode into Copper Creek as a group: Elijah, Tomas, Carmen, Diego, plus 3 other Mexican workers from neighboring ranches who'd experienced Wade's harassment but never reported it. Safety in numbers, solidarity in shared testimony, strength in refusing to be isolated and picked off individually. The courthouse was the largest building in Copper Creek, 2 stories of territorial authority built from stone that suggested permanence even in country where nothing lasted. People gathered outside, more than Elijah expected curious townspeople. Mexican families come to support Tomas, a handful of Apache who traveled from northern camps after hearing about Aquiana's arrest. And Wade's supporters, 20 or more, clustered near the entrance with the aggressive confidence of people whose prejudice had never been seriously challenged. They watched the arriving witnesses with open hostility, making comments just loud enough to be heard, but not quite loud enough to constitute actionable threat. Inside the courtroom was designed to intimidate high-ceiling dark wood, the judge's bench elevated to emphasize authority's position above common people. Territorial Judge Samuel Harmon presided from that height, his face carrying the stern neutrality of someone who'd learned to hide bias behind judicial demeanor. 60 years old, gray hair and matching beard, wearing black robes that made him look like Old Testament patriarch, dispensing divine judgment. Wade sat at the defendant's table beside his attorney, Henry Blackwood, a sharp-faced man from Phoenix whose reputation preceded him. Blackwood specialized in defending wealthy clients against accusations from poor ones, his strategy built on discrediting witnesses, exploiting prejudice, and making victims seem like criminals. Aiyana sat in the witness box, already her wrists no longer bandaged, scars visible where rope had burned deepest. She wore a simple dress provided by the jail, plain cotton, that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the determined woman Elijah knew. Her eyes found his across the courtroom, brief connection, before she looked away. The trial began with procedural formality. Judge Harmon outlined charges: theft of horse, valued at $30, assault on 3 white men resisting lawful authority. Each charge carried potential jail time, cumulative sentence that could amount to years in territorial prison. Then Blackwood began his case opening statement, delivered with practiced authority. This is simple matter of theft and violence. The defendant, an Apache woman with known criminal associations, stole valuable property belonging to Mr. Wade Harmon. When confronted, she attacked him and 2 companions, causing injury. When lawfully pursued, she resisted, requiring force to subdue. This is open and shut case of criminality dressed up as persecution. The rhetoric was effective, transforming victim into perpetrator, erasing context, reducing complex reality to simplistic narrative, where property rights trumped human suffering. Blackwood called Wade first. The direct examination was theatrical masterpiece, Wade describing the horse as family treasure, claiming Aiyana had been caught stealing it in the night, testifying that she'd drawn a knife and cut his arm when he tried to stop her. He rolled up his sleeve, showing shallow cut that could have come from anything, presenting it as evidence of assault. Did you tie her to a fence for her own safety and ours? Wade's voice carried rehearsed sincerity. She was wild, violent. We secured her and sent for the sheriff immediately. Would have been there in hours if Stone hadn't interfered. Cross-examination fell to public defender assigned to Aiyana's case, a young lawyer named Thomas Webb, who looked barely out of law school. He tried to establish contradictions, but Wade had been coached well, his answers consistent, even when obviously false. When Webb attempted to introduce evidence of Kuruk's murder, Judge Harmon sustained Blackwood's objection. Not relevant to current charges, Your Honor. We're trying theft and assault, not litigating historical grievances. But it establishes motive. The horse belonged to the defendant's brother, who was killed by Sustained. Judge Harmon's gavel cracked against wood. Stick to the charges, filed counselor. The pattern repeated throughout the morning. Every attempt to provide context was blocked. Every piece of evidence suggesting Wade's guilt was ruled inadmissible or irrelevant. The trial wasn't about discovering truth. It was about confirming predetermined conclusion while maintaining appearance of fairness. At midday break, Elijah found Webb outside the young lawyer, smoking with shaking hands. This is a disaster. Webb took a long drag. Harmon's blocking everything. Won't let me establish pattern, won't allow testimony about the brother's murder, won't even let witnesses describe the rope burns in detail. Says it's inflammatory and prejudicial. It's his son on trial, I know. But I can't say that. Can't accuse a sitting judge of bias without proof, and proof gets blocked because he controls what evidence is admissible. Webb ground out the cigarette with more force than necessary. I'm sorry, I'm trying, but the system's rigged against us here. What about afternoon testimony? My statement, Tomas's account, the other witnesses, I'll get them in. But Blackwood will shred their credibility. Elijah Stone, disgraced former soldier with history of insubordination. Tomas Reyes, Mexican laborer with obvious bias against his employer. Witnesses who didn't see the actual theft, only the aftermath. Webb met Elijah's eyes. I'll do my best. Just don't expect miracles. Afternoon session opened with Elijah's testimony. Webb walked him through events, carefully finding Ayanna tied to the fence, her condition, the injuries documented, Tomas's beating, Wade's explicit threats. Elijah kept his voice steady, his account factual, avoiding emotional language that could be dismissed as bias. Then Blackwood stood for cross-examination, and the dismantling began. Mr. Stone, you were dishonorably discharged from the United States Army. Correct, I was. For refusing a direct order during combat operations, for refusing to participate in massacre of civilians. Blackwood smiled. So you admit to disobeying lawful military command, to placing your personal judgment above legitimate authority. I refuse to kill children. Yes or no, Mr. Stone? Did you disobey orders? Yes, and you were flogged for this disobedience, received 50 lashes as punishment. Elijah's hand moved unconsciously to his wrist where the scar lived. I did. So you have history of claiming moral high ground while breaking rules you find inconvenient. History of deciding law doesn't apply when you disagree with it. Blackwood let that hang in the air. And now you're here testifying on behalf of an Apache woman accused of theft, asking this court to believe your version of events over those of multiple white witnesses. I'm testifying to what I saw, what I documented, what left physical evidence on her body, physical evidence that could have come from any number of sources. You didn't witness the alleged theft, did you know? But yes or no? No, I didn't witness the theft. So your testimony is speculation, personal interpretation of events you didn't see, filtered through obvious bias, and your established pattern of questioning legitimate authority. Blackwood turned to the judge. No further questions. The damage was surgical and complete. Elijah's credibility, already suspect because of his discharge, had been further undermined by framing his refusal to participate in war crimes as mere insubordination. To jury of white townspeople who'd never questioned military authority, the characterization probably landed effectively. Tomas testified next, his English heavily accented, his visible injuries the most powerful evidence he presented. But Blackwood attacked there too, suggesting the wounds came from drunken fight, rather than Wade's assault, implying Tomas had fabricated the story to avoid being fired for poor work performance. You drink, don't you, Mr. Reyes? Sometimes, not much, but you drink. You've been seen in the saloon in town. Yes, sometimes I. So you're a drinker who got in a fight and now blames his employer. Convenient story, but hardly credible. The other witnesses fared no better. Each one systematically discredited. Either they hadn't seen the relevant events directly, or they had personal reasons to lie, or their testimony conflicted in minor details that Blackwood magnified into major inconsistencies. By late afternoon, when Judge Harmon called recess until the following morning for closing arguments, the outcome felt predetermined. The trial had been ritual rather than investigation theater, designed to give injustice the appearance of legitimacy. Outside, the Apache witnesses gathered around Elijah, their faces carrying the bitter recognition of people who'd seen this script played out before. An older man, maybe 60, stepped forward. His face was weathered by sun and hardship, eyes carrying weight of accumulated grief. I am Dakota, Ayanna's uncle. He spoke English with careful precision. We hear you try to help. We thank you. But we know how this ends. White courts do not give justice to Apache people. We're not giving up yet. Tomorrow's closing arguments. Maybe, what another voice, younger, angrier. Another Apache man, late 20s, stepped into the circle. Maybe the white judge, who is father of white criminal, suddenly decides to be fair. That is your hope. Elijah had no counter-argument because the young man was right. Hope built on judicial integrity, where none existed, was delusion rather than strategy. What's your name, Neshoba? Kuruk's friend. I watch him die. Wade shoots him in back, then laughs while my friend bleeds. Neshoba's hand rested on knife at his belt, not quite threat, but not quite peaceful either. And now his sister goes to prison while murderer walks free. This is white justice. Dakota placed restraining hand on Neshoba's arm, speaking rapidly in Apache. The younger man responded angrily, gesturing toward the courthouse, toward Wade, who stood near the entrance, surrounded by supporters. The conversation escalated, other Apache joining and tension building. Elijah understood maybe one word in 10, but the meaning was clear. Some wanted to extract Ayanna from jail by force, deliver their own justice to Wade, refused to let the legal charade continue. Others counseled patience, argued that violence would only justify further persecution, reminded everyone that starting wars they couldn't win meant losing everything. A gunshot cracked the evening air. Everyone froze. Sheriff Talbot stood on the courthouse steps, rifle pointed skyward, smoke still curling from the barrel. Everybody calmed down. His voice carried the weariness of someone maintaining order through exhaustion and force of will. Trial's not over. There's process yet. Give the system time to work. System is broken. Neshoba spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. White man's law protects white men. That is only justice it knows. Maybe. But vigilante justice just gets people killed and solves nothing. Talbot lowered the rifle. I'm asking all of you, Apache Mexican, everyone go home tonight. Let tomorrow's proceedings happen. If the verdict is unjust, there are appeals, there are higher courts, there are ways to fight this that don't involve blood. Like the ways that worked so well in the past. Another Apache voice bitter with experience. Like the treaties that were broken. Like the reservations that starve us. Like the promises that meant nothing. Talbot had no answer for that because there was no answer. The system had failed these people repeatedly, demonstrating through consistent betrayal that law served power rather than justice. Asking them to trust that system now required faith they had no reason to possess. But the alternative was immediate violence that would definitely result in deaths, probably including Ayanna's, if the jail became battle site. So people dispersed gradually, reluctantly, anger unresolved, but temporarily contained by recognition that tomorrow might still offer slim chance of unexpected outcome. Elijah spent that night at the small boarding house in town, unable to ride back to the homestead and return by morning. He lay awake listening to sounds of Copper Creek after dark, drunks stumbling from the saloon, horses moving past somewhere, a woman crying somewhere else, laughter that sounded cruel. Morning arrived too soon and not soon enough, dawn breaking over a town that felt like it was holding its breath. Elijah returned to the courthouse early, finding it already filling with spectators. The crowd was larger than yesterday, word having spread about the trial's significance. Mexican families packed one side, Apache witnesses, another, white townspeople filled the middle and back. Segregation without formal policy, just the natural sorting of people along lines they'd been taught to respect. William Ashford sat in the press section, notebook already open, pen moving across paper as he captured details for his next article. He caught Elijah's eye, nodded once, expression grim. Judge Harmon entered precisely at 9, black robes billowing with ceremonial weight. Everyone rose, automatically conditioned response to authority, regardless of whether that authority deserved respect. Closing arguments began with Blackwood, his rhetoric polished and effective. The facts are simple. Property was stolen. When confronted, the thief became violent. Law enforcement intervened appropriately. Now we must enforce consequences, or we signal that theft and violence are acceptable when perpetrated by certain people against others. The argument was designed to activate prejudice while maintaining plausible deniability. Blackwood never explicitly mentioned race, but everyone understood. Certain people meant non-white, understood others meant white property owners. Then Webb stood for the defense, and Elijah felt something shift. The young lawyer's hands no longer shook. His voice carried new strength, as if he'd spent the night deciding that losing with honor beat winning through cowardice. Your Honor, this trial is not about property rights or law enforcement. It's about power and who gets to wield it without consequences. Wade Harmon has a pattern of violence. Witnesses testified to this. Evidence supports it. But we're not allowed to present that evidence because the court deems it inadmissible. Judge Harmon's gavel cracked. Counselor, you're treading dangerous ground. Am I? Webb turned to face the judge, directly abandoning the careful deference that had characterized his previous arguments. Because it seems to me the dangerous ground is a system where judges can preside over cases involving their own children, where evidence gets suppressed because it's inconvenient, where victims become criminals through judicial sleight of hand. Mr. Webb, you are in contempt of this court. Then hold me in contempt. Webb's voice rose, addressing the courtroom rather than the judge. Let that be part of the record, too. Young lawyer held in contempt for pointing out that justice can't exist when the judge is defendant's father. Maybe future historians will wonder why we pretended this was legitimate proceeding instead of predetermined outcome. Silence crashed over the courtroom. Nobody moved. Judge Harmon's face turned deep red veins standing out at his temples. His hand moved toward the gavel again, then stopped, perhaps recognizing that making Webb a martyr would only confirm the accusations. You may continue your closing argument. The judge's voice was tight with controlled fury. But if you mention my relationship to the defendant again, I will not only hold you in contempt, I will have you disbarred. Webb nodded slowly, turning back to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard testimony from multiple witnesses. You've seen physical evidence. You have the opportunity to send a message, either that all people deserve protection under law or that some people's lives and property matter more than others. The choice is yours. It wasn't great oratory, wouldn't be remembered as legal landmark, but it was honest, stripping away pretense, naming the prejudice that everyone recognized, but nobody wanted to acknowledge openly. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes, barely long enough to take a preliminary vote and fill out the verdict form. When they returned, their faces told the story before the foreman spoke. On the charge of theft, we find the defendant guilty. Ayana's expression didn't change. She'd known this outcome from the beginning, understood that the trial was performance rather than genuine inquiry into truth. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. Dakota stood from his seat, speaking in Apache that needed no translation. The tone carried grief and rage and bitter vindication. See, this is what white justice means. This is what we told you would happen. On the charge of resisting lawful authority, we find the defendant guilty. Judge Harmon gavelled for order, the sound sharp and final as axe striking wood. The defendant will rise for sentencing. Ayana stood her posture straight despite the verdict, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Elijah felt his chest constrict, knowing what came next, powerless to prevent it. On these charges, I sentence you to 5 years in the territorial prison. Judge Harmon's voice carried the satisfaction of victory. Furthermore, I hereby ban you from returning to this territory upon release. Any violation of this banishment will result in immediate arrest and additional sentencing. 5 years. For reclaiming her brother's horse, for surviving being tied to a fence, for having the audacity to exist while Apache in territory that wanted her erased. The courtroom erupted. Dakota and other Apache witnesses surged forward, only to be met by deputies with rifles raised. Mexican families shouted protests in Spanish and English, their voices blending into chorus of outrage. White spectators responded with their own shouts, support for the verdict, demands for order, threats against anyone who challenged the court's authority. Order Judge Harmon's gavel struck repeatedly, useless against the tide of emotion. I will have order, or I will clear this courtroom. Elijah pushed through the crowd toward the front, driven by instinct more than plan. He had no strategy, no clear idea what he intended to do, just the overwhelming need to not let this moment pass in complicit silence. He reached the barrier separating public from court officials, just as 2 deputies moved to take Ayana into custody. Without thinking, Elijah vaulted over the railing, putting himself between them and her. Stone don't, Talbot's voice carried warning. You can't help her this way. Then tell me what way I can help. Elijah kept his body positioned as shield. Tell me how law is supposed to work when it protects murderers and punishes victims. Explain how this is justice. It's not justice, it's law. And right now, law says step aside or get arrested for obstruction. Before Elijah could respond, someone grabbed his arm. Ayana, her grip surprisingly strong despite days in jail. Her eyes met his and she shook her head once. Don't. Her voice was quiet, meant only for him. This is my burden. Don't make it yours too. You shouldn't have to carry it alone. I'm not alone. She glanced toward the Apache witnesses, toward Dakota, who watched with tears streaming down weathered face. My people are here. They see this. They'll remember. That matters more than one person's freedom. The logic was sound, even if it felt like surrender. Elijah stepped back reluctantly, allowing the deputies to take her. They secured her hands with rope, not gentle, not harsh, just efficient, restraint of property being transferred from courtroom to prison wagon. As they led her away, Neshoba pushed through the crowd shouting in Apache, Whatever he said caused Ayanna to stop to turn to respond in their shared language. The exchange was brief but intense ending, with Nashoba nodding once grief and determination mixing in his expression. Then she was gone, disappeared through the side door that led to holding cells and transport. The courtroom slowly emptied, energy draining away as people recognized the performance had concluded that their presence no longer mattered. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down with indifferent intensity. Elijah stood on the courthouse steps watching people disperse into whatever came next for them. The Mexican families returned to their work to lives where this verdict was just another confirmation that law didn't protect them. The Apache witnesses gathered in separate groups speaking among themselves, planning something Elijah couldn't interpret but recognize as reaction to injustice. Thomas Webb appeared beside him, looking exhausted and somehow lighter, as if losing while fighting honestly weighed less than winning through compromise. They'll probably disbar me for that closing. Probably. Elijah watched the Apache group, noting how they'd formed circle, how Dakota spoke and others listened, with the intensity of people making important decisions. Was it worth it? Yeah. Webb pulled out a cigarette, hands only shaking slightly as he lit it. I got into law because I believed it could be forced for good. Took me 3 years to learn the system's rigged, that justice is what people with power say it is. That honest practice just means losing while feeling righteous. So what now? Now I do what I should have done from the start. Stop trying to win in broken system and start fighting to break the system instead. Webb blew smoke toward the cloudless sky. Ashford's publishing another article. I'm quoted extensively. Probably won't change anything, but at least the record will show some of us tried. William Ashford joined them on the steps, his notebook filled with observations. This is going to make waves. Not the good kind for Judge Harmon, for Wade, for anyone who thinks this verdict was acceptable. Will it free her? No. But it'll make her into symbol. Make this trial into example of everything wrong with frontier justice. Ashford looked toward where the Apache group still talked among themselves. And symbols matter. They rally people. They create movements. Sometimes they even create change. Sometimes isn't good enough. It's all we've got. The Apache group began to disperse, but Dakota approached the courthouse steps, walking with the dignity of someone who'd survived loss that should have destroyed him. He stopped in front of Elijah, studying him with eyes that measured character rather than appearance. You try to help my niece. This is good. Not enough, but good. Dakota's English came careful and deliberate. Now I tell you something. Ayanna, she is strong. 5 years in white prison will not break her. Will make her stronger, harder, more dangerous. That's a long time. Is nothing. Dakota's expression was unreadable. My people, we wait generations for justice. We watch children die, watch land stolen, watch everything taken, and we wait. Because we know white power is not eternal. Because we remember that empires fall and land remains. What are you going to do? What we always do. Survey them. Remember, wait for the moment when waiting is no longer required. He looked toward the horizon where his people had departed. Wade Harmon thinks he wins today. He does not understand what he creates. Are you threatening him? I am telling you truth. Dakota met Elijah's eyes directly. You are good man who sees injustice and tries to stop it. But you are one man. My people, we are thousands. Wade makes enemy of all of us today. That is a mistake that will cost him, even if cost comes slowly. The old man turned and walked away, his gait steady despite age, bearing the weight of cultural trauma, with the endurance of someone who'd learned that survival itself was resistance. Elijah remained on the courthouse steps as the sun angled toward evening, as shadows lengthened across the town, as normal life resumed around the crater left by judicial injustice. People went to the saloon. Stores prepared to close. Children played in the streets, unaware or uncaring that something broken had just revealed its fractures more clearly. A hand touched his shoulder. Carmen, with Tomas leaning on her for support, Diego trailing behind, looking older than his 16 years. We go back now. Carmen's voice was gentle. Nothing more we can do here. But Stone, you try. You fight. That matters even when fighting loses. Does it? Elijah felt exhaustion pulling at him, the weight of days spent preparing for trial that never had chance of delivering justice. What did any of it accomplish? It shows, my son, that good men exist. Tomas's voice was rough but firm. Shows him that not all white men are like Wade, that some people choose conscience over comfort. This is an important lesson, worth learning even in defeat. They left together, riding back toward the homestead in silence, broken only by horses' hooves and wind across open country. When they arrived, full darkness had settled, stars emerging with their usual indifferent brilliance. Inside the cabin, it felt emptier without Ayana's presence. Her absence occupied space like negative sculpture defining itself through what wasn't there. The corner where she'd slept, the forge tools she'd used, the small adjustments she'd made to how things were organized. Elijah sat at the table unable to muster energy for food or sleep, or any of the routines that marked time's passage. He'd failed. Simple as that. Tried to protect someone and watched the system grind her down anyway, demonstrating that individual action meant nothing against institutional power. A knock at the door pulled him from dark thoughts. He opened it to find William Ashford, the journalist's face lit by lantern he carried. Thought you should see tomorrow's edition. Ashford held out a newspaper ink still slightly wet. Rushed to print for distribution at dawn. The headline covered half the front page: Territorial Justice on Trial, Judge's Son Cleared, while Apache Woman Sentenced to 5 years. And the article was devastating, walking through the trial's contradictions. Webb's contempt citation, the systematic suppression of exculpatory evidence. Ashford had included statements from multiple witnesses, Apache perspectives on historical pattern of injustice, even quotes from legal scholars questioning the ethics of Judge Harmon's presiding. This is going to cause problems. Already has. Ashford's smile was grim. Got word an hour ago that Territorial Governor's Office is ordering investigation. Not into Wade, into Judge Harmon's conduct during trial. Probably won't amount to much, but it's something. Will it help Ayana? Not directly, but it might prevent next Ayana. Might make judges think twice before railroading defendants when their kids are involved. Might create paper trail that future appeals can reference. Might. The word carried more hope than certainty, more wish than prediction. Elijah wanted to feel encouraged, wanted to believe documentation and press coverage and procedural investigations meant something. But 5 years in territorial prison wasn't mitigated by newspaper articles or delayed investigations. There's more. Ashford's expression shifted. Less official, but you should know. Word around town is Wade's not satisfied with the verdict. Thinks you got off too easy, wants to finish what he started. Meaning, watch yourself. Keep your rifle close. Don't assume legal victory means he's done with you. After Ashford left, Elijah checked the perimeter, verified the horses were secured, ensured doors and windows could be quickly barricaded if necessary. All the small preparations that mark the difference between paranoia and prudence when someone powerful had explicitly targeted you. He slept lightly, waking twice to sounds that turned out to be wind or animals' hypervigilance that would probably persist for weeks until proven unnecessary. This was the cost of standing against power, not just immediate consequences, but the constant low-level anxiety of waiting for retaliation that might come today, tomorrow, next month, next year. Dawn arrived to find Elijah already at the forge working iron, because working iron was reliable and comprehensible in ways human systems weren't. Heat plus hammer plus time equaled to transformation. Simple, predictable, honest. Hoofbeats approached around mid-morning. Elijah's hand moved toward the rifle prop nearby, but relaxed when he recognized Sheriff Talbot riding alone, no deputies or backup suggesting official business. The sheriff dismounted slowly, exhaustion carved into every movement. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 3 days. Stone. Talbot's voice carried weariness beyond physical fatigue. Got something to tell you. Not official, just information you deserve to have. What is it? Wade's planning something. Don't know details, but my deputy overheard him last night. Wade was drunk, talking about teaching lessons, finishing business, making sure nobody forgets who runs things around here. So Ashford was right. Ashford's usually right. Talbot leaned against his horse, the animal taking his weight without complaint. Look, I know you don't have reason to trust law enforcement. Hell, after that trial, I don't have much reason to trust it either. But I'm telling you straight, Wade's not done. He's got something planned, and it probably involves you paying price for helping that Apache woman. What do you suggest I do? Leave. Pack up, head somewhere Wade's reach doesn't extend. Montana, maybe. California. Somewhere territorial judges and their criminal sons don't control everything. And if I don't want to leave, then prepare for trouble. Talbot straightened, preparing to remount. And understand that when trouble comes, I might not be able to help you. Legal obligation only goes so far when the judge's son is involved. I understand. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you keep choosing principles over survival. That's admirable. It's also stupid. Principles don't stop bullets, Stone. No, but abandoning principles means bullets already won. Talbot studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. Just don't expect me to mourn when stubbornness gets you killed. The sheriff rode off, leaving Elijah to contemplate the warning. Leave or stay. Run or fight. Surrender everything built here or risk losing everything, including life defending it. Not really a choice when framed that way, more like selecting which form of loss was most bearable. That night, as stars emerged and temperature finally dropped below, oppressive, Elijah sat on his porch considering options. The homestead represented 10 years of work, proof he could create something lasting despite military discharge and social exile. Walking away meant admitting that power always won, that people like Wade could simply take whatever they wanted through intimidation and violence. But staying meant accepting that Wade's planned retaliation would probably succeed, probably result in injury or death for Elijah and potentially anyone near him. The sound came just after midnight, multiple horses moving fast, approaching from 3 directions simultaneously. Coordinated attack, not random violence. Wade had planned this carefully, bringing enough men to overwhelm any defense approaching from angles that prevented escape. Elijah grabbed his rifle, moving to the window position that offered the best sight lines. In the barn, he heard movement, and Tomas and his family also alerted, also preparing for whatever came next. The rider stopped just outside rifle range, 8 or 9 men on horseback, backlit by moon that made identifying individuals impossible. One rode forward slightly, voice carrying across the distance with practiced projection. Stone, you in there! Elijah recognized Wade's voice, the slight slur suggesting alcohol had been part of preparation. He didn't respond, knowing that engaging meant giving away position, meant making himself target. I know you're in there. Wade's horse sighed, stepped, nervous energy transmitted from rider to mount. You think you're some kind of hero, protecting savages and criminals. Testifying against me. Still, Elijah stayed silent. Rifle aimed but not fired, waiting to see how far Wade would push before triggering consequence. Here's what's going to happen. Wade's voice rose, anger overcoming whatever plan he had started with. You're going to come out, walk away from this property, leave everything behind, and if you ever show your face in this territory again, I'll kill you myself, understand? The demand was explicit threat or property theft dressed up as ultimatum. Agree to be exiled or face immediate violence. Either way, Wade won. Elijah made his decision. He stepped onto the porch, rifle held ready, but not aimed, body visible in moonlight. The move was calculated risk, showing himself made him target, but also demonstrated he wasn't hiding, wasn't afraid, wasn't going to comply through intimidation. This is my land. I paid for it legal, built it myself. You don't have authority to order me anywhere. Wade laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. Authority. You think authority matters? I just watched my father preside over trial where I was defendant, where I clearly beat that Mexican half to death and tied that Apache whore to a fence. And you know what happened? You got away with it. Exactly, because authority is whatever power says it is. And right now, I've got 8 armed men backing me up. What have you got? My conscience, your conscience. Wade's horse shifted, reflecting rider's agitation. And what's that worth when you're dead, more than your father's judgment seat? More than all the power you inherited without earning. More than victory that requires terrorizing people weaker than yourself. The words landed with more impact than Elijah expected. Even across the distance, he saw Wade's posture change, saw the anger that came from truth spoken plainly. Big words for a man who is about to lose everything. Wade gestured to the riders behind him. Last chance, Stone. Walk away, or we burn you out. Before Elijah could respond, movement erupted from multiple directions. Figures rose from concealment in the scrub around the property, 20, maybe 30 people who'd positioned themselves silently in darkness surrounding Wade's group. The moonlight caught faces, Apache warriors, Mexican workers, even a few white townspeople who'd decided Wade's behavior had crossed acceptable lines. Dakota's voice cut through the tension. You bring 8 men, we bring 30. And we know this land, know every rock, every hollow, every place to hide and shoot from. Wade's horse reared slightly, his surprise visible even in dim light. You don't have authority here. This is white man's business. This stopped being white man's business when you made war on all of us. Dakota moved forward, his rifle held with comfortable familiarity. You beat Mexican workers, murder Apache young men, tie women to fences, steal property, and then hide behind your father's authority when consequences arrive. Another voice joined in Mexican accent, thick but English clear. You want to burn Stone's property? Try. But know that 20 guns aim at you right now. And we are not good shots because we practice, but we are very motivated because you give us reasons. Wade's men shifted nervously, calculating odds that no longer favored them. 8 against 30, with defenders in covered positions and attackers exposed on horseback. The mathematics of violence suddenly looked very different. Elijah felt something shift inside him, understanding dawning. This wasn't about him defending himself, wasn't about individual resistance against overwhelming power. This was community decision that Wade had gone too far, that his pattern of violence threatened everyone, that allowing him to continue meant accepting that terror was inevitable. The group surrounding Wade's riders represented coalition of the marginalized people who individually had no power, but collectively couldn't be ignored. Apache and Mexican working together despite their own historical tensions, unified by common enemy and common desire for safety. You're making a mistake. Wade's voice carried less confidence now. My father. Your father is under investigation for judicial misconduct. Talbot's voice emerged from the darkness as the sheriff rode up, positioning himself carefully between the two groups. Got the order this afternoon. Territorial Governor's Office is reviewing every case he's presided over in the last 5 years, including today's trial. That doesn't change anything. Wade tried to regain authority. Ayanna was still convicted. The verdict stands. For now, but appeals get filed. Evidence gets reviewed by judges who aren't your father. And if that trial was as corrupt as it looked, verdict gets overturned. Talbot moved his horse slightly closer. So here's what happens next. You and your men ride back to town, now. You don't stop at Stone's property. You don't threaten anyone. You just leave. And if we don't, then I arrest all of you for attempted arson, for armed threats against territorial residents, for vigilantism. Talbot gestured to the surrounding Apache and Mexican witnesses. And we've got 36 witnesses who'll testify you came here to burn a man out of his home. Even your father can't sweep that away when the governor's watching. For a long moment, nobody moved. The night held its breath, violence still possible, but still hovering just beyond manifestation. Then Wade's shoulders slumped slightly, the posture of someone recognizing that tactical retreat was smarter than catastrophic defeat. This isn't over. Yeah, it is. Elijah's voice carried across the distance, firm and final. You lost tonight, Wade, not because I'm stronger or smarter or better armed, but because you finally pushed enough people far enough that they decided to push back. And there's 30 of them here, probably 100 more who'd come if called. You can't intimidate that many people. Wade stared at him, hatred visible even in moonlight. Then he wheeled his horse and rode off his men, following with the relief of people granted unexpected reprieve. The coalition held position until the sounds of retreating horses faded completely. Then gradually people emerged from their concealment positions. Apache warriors who'd positioned themselves with tactical precision. Mexican workers who'd brought whatever weapons they could access. Even a few white townspeople who decided their conscience mattered more than social safety. Dakota approached the porch, his expression carrying grim satisfaction. Tonight we show Wade that hunting us individually is different from facing us together. This is a good lesson. We should have learned it sooner. Why didn't you fear? Habit. Memory of all the times resistance brought massacre. Dakota's eyes reflected starlight. But today's trial, it changes something. Makes us angry enough to overcome fear. Makes us understand that submission does not bring safety, just slower death. Tomas emerged from the barn, Carmen and Diego behind him. The Mexican man moved carefully, still favoring injuries, but standing upright with dignity restored. We help each other now. We watch for Wade. We keep safe together. His English was clearer tonight, as if crisis had burned away the hesitation that usually accompanied speaking in language not his own. This is how we survive. The coalition dispersed gradually, people returning to homes and camps. But something fundamental had shifted. They'd acted collectively, demonstrated that coordinated resistance was possible, created precedent for future cooperation. Elijah sat on his porch long after everyone left, processing what had happened. He hadn't saved Ayanna. She was still in prison, still facing 5 years of incarceration for the crime of reclaiming stolen property. But perhaps he'd help create conditions where next time community response would come faster, would be stronger, would actually prevent injustice instead of just documenting it. 3 days later, William Ashford returned with news that territorial governor had officially suspended Judge Harmon pending investigation into judicial misconduct. The suspension didn't free Ayanna, but it meant Harmon couldn't preside over other cases, couldn't continue pattern of protecting his son and people like him from consequence. Small victory, fragile and incomplete, but victory nonetheless. Years passed. Elijah continued working his forge, his reputation gradually transforming from exiled troublemaker to reliable blacksmith who'd stood against injustice. Mexican families brought him work. Apache traders occasionally stopped by their presence, marking acceptance he hadn't earned but had been granted through action during crisis. Thomas Webb did get disbarred for his courtroom outburst, but immediately opened practice as advocate for tribes and workers, using his legal knowledge to fight the system from outside it. His cases rarely won, but they created records, established precedents, built foundations for future attorneys who'd have more tools and less corrupt opposition. William Ashford continued publishing articles about frontier injustice, his work eventually reaching Eastern papers, where readers far from territorial corruption could pressure federal government for reforms. The changes came slowly, often inadequately, but they came. Wade Harmon faced no criminal charges for his violence, protected by connections and wealth, and system designed to shelter people like him. But his social capital diminished, his reputation increasingly toxic even among those who'd previously supported him. Eventually, he left the territory heading to California, where his father's name carried less weight. And Ayanna served her 5 years surviving territorial prison through the same determination that had kept her alive when tied to a fence. When she finally walked free, she didn't return to the territory banishment, still in effect, still enforceable. But letters arrived occasionally postmarked from Denver, from Montana, from places where Apache women with forged skills could make living and build something resembling life. The last letter came 5 years after her release, brief and matter of fact. I teach others now. Metalwork. How to create instead of just endure. I think you would approve. The mare recovered fully, though she still favors that leg when tired. She remembers you. So do I. Elijah kept the letter in his workshop, tucked between the pages of a journal, where he recorded techniques and measurements. Sometimes while working iron, heating and shaping and transforming raw material into useful objects, he thought about Ayanna doing similar work somewhere else, creating her own version of resistance through the simple act of making things. They'd lost the immediate fight. The trial had been farce, the verdict predetermined, the 5 years of imprisonment, a wound that would never fully heal. But they'd shown each other and everyone watching that some people refused to accept cruelty as inevitable. That resistance was possible even when victory wasn't guaranteed. That choosing conscience over comfort mattered even when, especially when the cost was steep. The scar on Elijah's wrist remained thin white line that marked his refusal at Sand Creek. Ayanna carried her own scars, rope burns that had healed into documentation of survival. Different wounds from different injustices, but similar message. We were here, we fought back. We refused to make it easy for those who tried to break us. In the end, that refusal was its own form of victory, not the kind that brought immediate relief or guaranteed happy endings, but the kind that proved humanity could persist even in systems designed to extinguish it. The kind that showed future generations that their ancestors had been more than victims, had been resistors who chose defiance over submission. And sometimes in a world that bent consistently toward injustice, that small defiance was enough to justify the whole painful effort of remaining human.